of the Rules and Reference and Public Safety Committee to order. This joint hearing of the Public Safety Committee and the Rules and Reference Committee is to provide city officials an opportunity to update the Community Safety Advisory Commission, as well as hear from individuals in the field of independent police oversight and investigation. A few weeks ago, Council announced a legislative package made up of 4 distinct items that we intend to move before our legislative break in August. At the press conference, we told the public that what we plan to do, we told the public when we plan to do it, and I asked that the public hold us accountable for what we said. So we're putting forward legislation around demilitarization, around no-knock raids, hate group affiliations, and independent oversight and investigation. Today's hearings will focus on providing updates to the Columbus Community Safety Advisory Commission, as well as a discussion of independent police oversight and investigations. I've been public that I believe our city needs a civilian review board and an independent investigatory body. There are many tough questions about how we get there, and tonight we're going to look at effective practices and learn from folks who have been there before. To move the conversation forward, we are legally required to negotiate how a new system would be implemented with the FOP Lodge 9. While council doesn't run those negotiations, we ask that all of our police officers and the FOP participate in this discussion. It is important that we put forward something that works, something that is fair and equitable, something that ensures mutual respect and trust that can be built again. This is an issue where we need to be proactive and progressive, so both our residents and our officers get the justice that they deserve. We aren't going to settle every question tonight. We know there's a lot of work ahead for other groups as we dive into this conversation as a community. But it is important to begin socializing this topic and to learn from what others are doing around the country. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to my counterpart, my council member, Councilmember Rob Dorrance, to provide an overview of this afternoon's agenda.
Thank you, Council President Harden. Before we begin, I wanted to thank everyone for being here. Wanted to run through the agenda for folks that are with us at home. We're going to give open council members that are here with us this evening. Chair Janet Jackson of the Safety Advisory Commission will speak. We'll have a presentation from City Attorney Klein. We'll have a presentation from Chief of Police Thomas Quinlan and members of his staff, and then have an opportunity to hear from some leaders within civilian oversight of police organizations, and then, of course, allow the public to speak tonight. So with that, I wanted to thank, obviously, the council members that are with us here tonight, President Harden, Chair Mitch Brown of the Public Safety Committee, Councilmember Remy, or President Pro Tem Brown, I apologize, and Councilmember Favor. Also want to thank, again, City Attorney Klein, the Chief of Police Tom Quinlan, the National Association for Civilian Law Enforcement, and our staff here at Council, including Kevin McCain from my staff, Zach Davidson from the Council President's Office, and our Chief of Staff, Mike Brown, as well as others. Certainly thank you to the members of public who are taking time out tonight to tune in virtually to learn more about this topic. We need to build trust between the community and the Division of Police. Establishing a civilian review board with subpoena power and a professionally staffed investigative unit outside the Division of Police to review uses of force incidents and citizen complaints is a necessary step that I believe we can move forward on while creating a process that is fair and transparent to our citizens and our officers. We've had a lot of hearings over the past few weeks, and we will have more in the next 2 weeks, and I want to stress that the need for reform is meaningful. And we need that reform to have a lasting impact on addressing systemic racism and ensure that our residents have confidence in our safety forces within our community. And that's why we're here today. We're here today to learn. City Council is committed to ensuring a transparent and thorough process when it comes to reimagining civilian oversight here in our city. The purpose of this hearing is to hear updates from the Community Safety Advisory Commission, our city attorney, our Division of Police, and learn more about what civilian oversight looks like in other cities in Ohio and across the nation, and what this could mean and look like here in Columbus. Tonight, we'll hear about some of the steps that we must take to get us there. I want to remind folks that this hearing is available to live stream on the CTV website, on the City Council Facebook page, and YouTube, and is being broadcast on Spectrum Channel 1024, WOW Channel 3, and AT&T UVerse Channel 99. The video of this hearing will also be posted on our YouTube channel following this event. I'd like to take a moment to offer the opportunity for my colleagues who have joined us tonight to offer opening remarks as we begin this hearing. First, I'd like to offer the floor to my friend and the chair of the Public Safety Committee, Mitch Brown. Mitch, I think you are still muted, my friend. There you
go. Thank you, Council President Harden and Councilor Dorns, in hosting this meeting this afternoon, this public hearing. It's important to reiterate that our community wants and needs a division of police to protect their rights and to justify and enforce the laws against those who wish to do them harm. It is imperative that we have a well-trained, well-equipped law enforcement agency that reflects the values of our community. I support Chief Quinlan in his efforts to improve the Columbus Division of Police. Those efforts must ensure that the members of the division are accountable to the community they serve. I believe there must be internal and external component to the disciplinary process to guarantee a thorough review of officer misconduct. It is critical that any misconduct is addressed with the appropriate consequences. The majority of the Columbus police officers have a true calling to protect and serve the residents of the city with integrity, compassion, and respect. However, there is work to be done to sustain the community's trust. Our entire community, especially the officers within the division, must hold themselves to a high standard of excellence. I look forward to today's discussion on how to incorporate the community's perspectives into the division's disciplinary process, and am open-minded on the issues that are going to address the issue of a civilian review of our police officers' conduct. So thank you, Councilor Dorns, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Chair Brown. Next, I'd like to recognize President Pro Tem Liz Brown.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Dorans, and thank you to my colleagues for convening this hearing today. I appreciate the participation of all presenters and, of course, those members of the public who've signed up to testify. I fully expect to learn a lot today. I was just this afternoon talking to my colleague, Councilmember Mitchell Brown, about the stakes of this hearing and of what we're endeavoring to do here in Columbus by building a civilian review board. The fact that we don't have one yet means that we can do this right in Columbus. We can learn from other cities, learn from these experts that are here today, learn from the members of our Community Safety Advisory Commission who put so much time and energy and intellect into producing the recommendations they had. And I am looking forward to the conversation that unfolds today, having questions along the way, and ensuring, as my colleague said right before me, that we put resident trust at the forefront of this effort to build a civilian review board. Thank you so much, Councilmember Dorans.
Thank you, President Pro Tem Brown. Councilmember Favor.
Good afternoon, everyone. To Council President Harden and Councilmember Dorans, Chair Brown, thank you for convening tonight's conversation hearing. I would echo the comments made by President Pro Tem Brown, and just truly being excited to learn this evening, to engage with subject matter experts, so that we can truly build a robust review board that is an improvement on what we know, what we have seen other review boards across the country. And I'm just looking to really learn more about what we can do in Columbus to strengthen, excuse me, that's the word I was looking for, to strengthen the power of the review board that we're trying to bring here in Columbus. So thank you for convening tonight's conversation, and I just look forward to learning.
Thank you, Councilmember Favor, and certainly not last or least, Councilmember Emmanuel Remy.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Dorans. I appreciate the opportunity, as my colleagues have stated today, to hear today from subject matter experts. I certainly appreciate the time that we've spent over the last few weeks convening hearings and the ones that are upcoming. Certainly the one that I'll be co-hosting with Councilmember Brown tomorrow, Chair Brown, on no-knock warrants. But this has been a great opportunity to learn, to listen, to understand what the community would like to see with their police force, and certainly understand through some very intimate conversations some of the challenges that our police officers face within the structure they currently have. And so, this has been a full-time expedition to make sure that we're doing things right, and we are being thoughtful in what we're going to propose to the community. I know that there's been some significant movement, that things that haven't been announced at this point, but certainly will be in the near future, that I feel are real positive gains for all of us. And so I look forward to this hearing this evening to learn more. I certainly want to thank the Community Safety Advisory Commission for their work, their ongoing work, and certainly the work that's being done to form the Civilian Review Board. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, and thank you for the opportunity.
Councilmember Remy, would you mind just mentioning again the time for the hearing tomorrow with you and Chair Brown on the consideration of no-knock warrants?
Certainly, we will be in the same format tomorrow evening at 4 o'clock. Written testimony and or speaker slips are accepted through 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. Can be sent to my assistant, Lucy Frank, LJ at columbus.gov. But we look forward to a very thorough conversation about the subject and learning more about how they're used as a tool within the department.
Thank you, Councilmember Remy. Next, I would just like to thank the members of the Community Safety Advisory Commission that are here with us this evening, and certainly I know a few could not be. These folks put in countless hours over a significant period of time to review how the city currently looks at public safety, and certainly made lots of recommendations to council, to the city attorney, to the mayor's office about how do a better job, not only for our own personnel, but also speaking directly to the needs of the community. And I know I've been fortunate to review that document as sort of a guiding star as undertaken what council has done over the past month, taking a hard look at what we can do to reimagine public safety. So just my undying thanks to the folks that have already done that work that's really laid a foundation for what council has really taken up over this past month. And I know even after break, we'll continue to focus on. So with that, I would like to introduce the chair of that committee, someone who's no stranger to public safety or the city of Columbus, Chair Janet Jackson.
Mr. Councilmember, Chair Jackson was not able to join us this evening, so I think we're going to go straight to our city attorney, Zach Klein. Sorry about that.
Yep, no problem. City Attorney Klein.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me, Council? Great. I always get concerned that I'm going to be talking into an abyss, so I'm glad that the communications and technology is working right now. And certainly I'm grateful for council and the Safety Commission's opportunity to speak and bring some updates from the City Attorney's Office on important police reforms in the City of Columbus. I want to thank and recognize council as well as the Mayor's Office and our continued partnership to bring about these important conversations and the actual actions that are going to take place to reform the culture of justice in the City of Columbus, ranging from policing all the way up to what happens in our courthouses. The death of George Floyd and the protests that have followed are a constant reminder of how we need to change the culture of justice in the city of Columbus. In June, my team introduced 8 specific reforms that the city attorney's office, based on its experience with prosecutors, litigators who are every day working with the Division of Police or defending the Division of Police, and recognizing how, from a legal perspective and as the city's legal advisor, how we can use our office to leverage and make a difference. And to give a quick reminder of what those are, they were 8 proposals, 4 of which dealt with the protests themselves, and the next 4 really looking into the underlying reasons why people are protesting. And being able to differentiate the two, because the first 4 really are an analysis and a reaction to specific events that took place late May through present, while the latter 4 really deal with identifying and breaking down the systematic and structural barriers of racism that does exist in policing as much as it exists in healthcare, it exists in education, it exists in housing, in banking, in mortgages, in the economy. And that no really system in our society is immune to these historical and racist, race-based and oftentimes class-based structures that put people behind, that really create barriers to success that need to be identified and torn down. Just to remind the council what the 8 were, 1 was to conduct an independent after-action review of how the city of Columbus handled the protests from late May until present. Number 2, review CPD policies and procedures related to clearing the streets to ensure we're balancing protesters' First Amendment rights with public safety. 3, change CPD policy on the use of chemical agents. 4, submit evidence to IAB to review alleged incidents of police misconduct during protests. Number 5, we're going to the heart of this hearing, create a citizen review board and review the current FOP contract for opportunities for improvement. 6, moving charging decisions for alleged misdemeanor offenses from the Division of Police to in-house in the city attorney's office, giving prosecutors more authority to decide what actually is being charged. Number 7, review the city code related to traffic and pedestrian offenses and examine the impact of those offenses on the Black community and people of color. And number 8, provide CPD recruits with additional immersive cultural immersion training to help them build relationships to the neighborhoods that they serve. I'm dedicated to the vision of a more fair and equitable criminal justice system, just like this council is, and just like members of the Safety Commission are. My staff has committed themselves to these priorities as well, and I'm proud of the work that they're doing to move the ball forward to make these reforms a reality. And we've made important progress to date of each of the goals that I outlined, and we continue to make progress. As many as you know well, meaningful change is not done overnight, but that doesn't mean that we don't recognize that reform needs to happen now. Our community deserves these changes, and we want to ensure that they're solidly in motion before we make further announcements. But at this time, I do think it's important to talk about some of the action that's happened. The mayor and the council announced the creation of the Citizen Review Board panel that's going to, in conjunction with what is brought forth in this hearing, provide a guideline of what exactly we want as a community out of our Citizen Review Board. My office, in conjunction with at the request of the Division of Police and the Department of Public Safety, we reviewed the allegations of police misconduct that were submitted to the Internal Affairs Bureau, as well as the Mayor's Action Hotline. We have, as I stated in a previous hearing, we've identified which one of those are actionable for potential administrative discipline, and which ones are actionable for potential criminal investigation. We have passed that review on to a retired FBI agent who our office worked to identify and help hire to provide a thorough investigation. We provided guidance to the Division of Police as it relates to changing directives pertaining to chemical agents and its use. Those directives have been changed, as well as provided suggested draft language surrounding the initiative 8 Can't Wait, so that the division Chief Quinlan and his community advisory group has a working frame of how and when we can be in line with the 8 Can't Wait policies. In the coming weeks, I want to assure this council and the public that we will have concrete actions that are very specific and action items to announce. We're very close on some, and I am excited about this, but about the opportunities and the impact that these changes are going to have for the better and the improvement, not only of the Division of Police to make our community safer, but to make it safer for our officers and their families too. We're committed to this change, just like we know that you are, Council, and we stand ready to continue to work with you and the administration to reform the culture of justice from policing all the way up to the courthouse.
Thank you, City Attorney Klein. After each of our presentations from the folks this evening, we're going to give an opportunity for council members and members of the Safety Advisory Committee to ask questions. However, right now I am missing a number of folks' faces with some technical challenges. So I'm going to go around and ask the council members if they have any questions of you, City Attorney, and then I'd like to open it up to members of the commission, but I may need them to speak up if they have a question, and hopefully the technology won't fail us here. So first, I'm going to go around the dais here. President Pro Tem, did you have any questions for City Attorney Klein?
Thank you, Council Member. No, thank you, City Attorney, for being here, and thank you for the proactive proposals that you put out a couple months ago. I truly appreciate the work of you and the work of your staff.
Thank you, President Pro Tem.
Chair Mitch Brown.
City Attorney, could you speak to the issue about chemical agents? And since that was one of the 8 that you had discussed, could you elaborate in a little more detail about those?
Thank you to President Hardin and Chair Brown of the Public Safety Committee. As the council recalls, the suggested changes as it relates to the use of mace and pepper spray was refined to twofold. The first being the limitation of the use of pepper spray and mace to only aggressive and violent crowds, as well as the limitation that the sole reason of being in the street is not a permissible use of mace or pepper spray. Separately from that, because I think oftentimes mace, pepper spray, and tear gas all get lumped in together. Collectively, they are different, but separate from that, as the use of tear gas was banned on an outright as it relates to moving crowds.
Thank you, City Attorney. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Chair Brown. This is where we come up in my portion of the dais. So I had one question for you, City Attorney Klein, and I think this is just to give you an opportunity to explain a little bit more about the process. And I think it's helpful, especially for the reason that we've come here this evening. You mentioned that your office has reviewed instances of potential that occurred around the protest. I know that your office has developed sort of additional protocols for taking a look at those cases outside of what is normally done with the Division of Police. I wonder if you could speak to those for those of the members of the public that are tuning in tonight. And I think that may help level set some of our later conversation within this hearing about where the city could potentially go in looking at these types of investigations.
Thank you, Council Member, Council President Hardin, to Councilmember Dorans. So essentially, when members of the public submitted allegations of police misconduct, either to IAB or to the Mayor's Action Hotline, at the request of the Department of Public Safety and the Division of Police, we put a prosecutor, my chief prosecutor, in fact, who has many years prosecutorial experience, in the room to help and assist with the initial review of those allegations. And for lack of better description, if you'll bear with me, Councilmember Dorans, those were essentially broken up into 4 buckets. The first was just a bucket of people suggesting changes that the Division of Police should make. No specific conduct allegation other than just they didn't like or were making suggestions. They didn't like conduct that they maybe heard about or saw, or wanted to make suggestions to the Division of Police of how to change their tactics. The second bucket would be a bucket where it would either be like insufficient evidence, or the review the initial review looked like it was a permissible use of force. The third bucket was a review that determined that it is a questionable use of force that should be investigated administratively for potential employee discipline. And then the fourth bucket was a review that it's initially determined that review could potentially rise to the level of criminal conduct. So starting in that last bucket, the criminal conduct bucket, that's where the city attorney's office and working with the Department of Public Safety and Administration, we identified a former retired FBI agent who the city engaged to then do follow-up and further investigation beyond just the simple video evidence that was submitted. So that means obviously looking at the video evidence, but actually going out in the field and talking to the victims and helping identify who those victims are, talking to officers involved that actually did the suspected use of force, as well as other officers who may be identified on videotape that were there and saw the event potentially. So that investigation is like any other investigation that I think anyone would understand like how that would work. So that's being done by a retired FBI agent. Out of the incidences that are being reviewed for criminal review, there is a possibility that all instances then will be referred for prosecution. Some instances may be referred for prosecution, or no instances will be reviewed and will be referred to prosecution. If there are no instances referred to prosecution, that does not mean that incident is then that the officer is then exonerated, as much as it means that there's no criminal review. The criminal review would be over. Then those instances that were non-criminal in nature, as determined by the retired FBI agent, will then be referred back into the administrative bucket for potential employee discipline. Before I get there to the employee discipline side, I still would like to discuss and have the opportunity about the potential criminal. So should the retired FBI agent determine that one or several instances should be then referred for prosecution, my office is working in helping identify who an independent prosecutor would be that would make a probable cause determination and then prosecute the case outside my office. I've made the decision because of mainly two reasons. One, of just being the lawyer for the city of Columbus, and two, to ensure the utmost independence that we will be seeking an independent prosecutor to review any probable cause and subsequent prosecutions should the FBI agent determine that that is necessary and put forth for criminal prosecution. As it relates directly to the administrative review.
Are we able to interject a question?
Ms. Tammy, if you just give me 2 more minutes, I'll finish up on the administrative, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. But I want to yield to Councilmember Doran since he's running the meeting. But as it relates to the administrative review, the Department of Public Safety engaged the law firm Baker and Hostetler to do that independent administrative review. So instead of IAB, which traditionally may do this work, Baker and Hostetler will be doing those sort of interviews that traditionally would be done through the traditional IAB process. So Baker and Hostetler will be doing the investigation and then making those, whatever the findings of those investigations are, they will make and refer those to the chain of command for potential discipline.
Thank you, City Attorney Lang. Commissioner, we're going to go ahead and go through the council members, and then I'm going to go through the Safety Commission, if that's okay. So next, I'd like to ask if Councilmember Favor has any questions for City Attorney Klein.
Thank you, Councilmember Dorrance. Not at this time. Just truly want to extend my appreciation once again to City Attorney Zach Klein's office and all of the diligent work they've done over the past few months. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Remy.
Thanks so much, Councilmember Dorrance. Just want to extend my sincere thanks to the City Attorney's Office. I know how responsive they've been in our inquiries about certain protocols and things that we might be exploring. Appreciate their proposals as well as we look to what the future holds. And so just know that the city attorney is working very hard along with his staff, and thank him immensely for that work.
Thank you, Councilman.
Thank you, Councilmember Remy. I'm now going to open it up to the commissioners, and I'm going to go through it as it's arranged on my virtual deck here, which just so happens that Commissioner Alasada, you are up first, and you're welcome to ask a question of City Attorney Klein.
Thank you. It's good to have A as a last name. I appreciate that.
It does help.
It helps a lot. Gets you to the front of the line. couple questions I have. One in regard to, and this question is to City Attorney Zach Klein. You mentioned that we have sounds like I heard you say independent retired police officer who is investigating, but you have not named that person. Is that intentionally, or are we going to name who that person is my first question. And that person would be reviewing and referring cases for prosecution. And so what does that process look like? I heard you say that there is a law firm, Baker and Hofstetter. My second question would be, is this law firm directly related and have they represented the Fraternal Order of Police? What is their relationship to them? Much of what we found out in the commission was that many people that are investigating are either members of the Fraternal Order of Police or have a direct relationship too. So that would be my second question. My third question, could you expound a little bit more on what independent looks like? Does it mean that these entities and these people will be doing totally separate outside of the network of public safety investigations, or is this tied to and caught up in? And I think that was a lot of our concern as we reviewed some of this process in the Safety Commission, was each role led to people that were investigating that were either members of the Fraternal Order of Police or some way connected or representing the Fraternal Order of Police.
Okay, Ms. Alsada, Commissioner, I'll try to answer those questions. If I know there were three, if I leave something out, obviously feel free to follow up. The gentleman's name, he's a retired FBI agent. He has no connection to the Division of Police. His name's Rick Wozniak. He was asked to do these criminal investigations as any criminal investigation he would do as an FBI agent, or whether he was a law enforcement officer working for any specific division of police. So he's the one who's going out interviewing the people involved, and he, based on his recommendations, then will make a referral, potentially, depending on what he finds in each case, to a prosecutor. In this instance, it typically would be the Columbus City Attorney's Office, because this office does have jurisdiction over these matters because they occur within the Columbus City limits. But because of conflict of interest with my office, as well as the importance of having complete independence to ensure the public that this is going to be done in a way that's above board, my own office is seeking a special prosecutor, someone completely independent of my office, to work with Mr. Wozniak on any potential determinations that he may have based on his findings in his own investigation. That's on the criminal side. On the administrative side, the potential employee discipline side, that's where the law firm Baker and Hostetler was hired. They will be doing their investigations for those instances that did not, on initial review, appear to rise to the level of potential criminal conduct. Baker and Hostetler, to my knowledge, does not represent the FOP in any instances. As a matter of fact, Baker and Hostetler is a firm that's represented the city of Columbus for many years, decades, in its contract negotiations against the FOP, as well as representing the city of Columbus in its negotiations with the Division of Fire, the IAFF, as well as AFSCME and CWA, which are the four main bargaining units that employees are associated with the city of Columbus. I'm unaware of any sort of relationship of any of the players that I have mentioned thus far in having any sort of direct nexus or tie with the Division of Police. Did I answer all three questions, Commissioner?
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You have a better memory than I, City Attorney Klein. Thank you, Commissioner, for those questions. And I apologize, in my haste to get to the commission, I forgot to allow the opportunity for Council President Harden to ask you any questions to the Attorney Klein, but he informs me that he does not have any, and he says thank you for your work. So I'm going to, I'm sure, get punished here at some point by that. So that's a joke. Next, I'd like to offer the opportunity for Commissioner Buster to ask any questions to City Attorney Klein.
Hi, thank you. I'm not sure if this is quite the right person. Thank you for the opportunity. I just wondered if anybody from our Hot Topics subcommittee was asked to be on that panel that was named to look further into the Civilian Review Board.
Commissioner, I will yield that question to the council president and the mayor. My office was not involved in selecting those individuals.
Okay, thank you. That's it.
Commissioner, I do not know offhand, but I will have either my office or Council President Harden's office follow up with you about that.
Okay, great. That was the subcommittee that looked the most at this topic, and so it sort of seemed like a bit of an oversight not to have somebody as part of that panel.
I'm sorry, Vlad, I don't have a list, but I thought I saw that Vlad, which chaired our Hot Topic Committee, was on that, I think. Am I wrong or right? I haven't kept up with so many announcements, but I know Tiffany White, myself, and Vlad chaired the Hot Topic, or Vlad chaired, and we were part of that committee. And yes, we did look extensively at the citizen review process. And so I agree with you, Emily. I think if we're going to move forward and really move forward from the recommendations that are put forward, then we do need someone that has really talked to and studied, and that happened in, and thank you for reminding us, that happened in the Hot Topics Committee.
Yes.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll make sure we follow up with you unless, so the next commissioner I'd like to give an opportunity to ask any questions of City Attorney Klein is Commissioner Brooks, or Burns, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I actually don't have questions for Mr. Klein. I may have additional questions after the next round of presentations, though.
Sure. Thank you. Commissioner Griffin?
Nothing at this time, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Sink?
No questions other than just a comment that I know the review of particularly traffic rules was underway, and I really look forward to seeing more of that as that comes out.
Thank you. Commissioner Wilkinson?
Thank you. Just a brief question to the city attorney. And again, about, the traffic goal, one of the 8 items that you talked about. I'm not sure 100% clear. Heard you mention it a couple of times about the traffic issues. Does that presuppose that what you want to look at are issues related to bias and stops and traffic, or profiling persons in the African American community? And if that's the case, does that suggest that we already know what's going on and not doing anything about it, or what exactly prompted that as an issue in your 8-point plan?
Thank you, Commissioner, to Council President Harden, Chair Dorans, and certainly to Commissioner Wilkinson. Our office is gathering information from the clerk's office as we speak, with a look back of 3 years of traffic, pedestrian, and bicycle offenses, looking certainly at racial breakdown, but also going into a dive of which ones are most commonly used. And I think we're going to be able to take a step back once we identify which ones are most commonly used. The next step would then be to determine whether we should consider as a city, certainly with the advice and consent and ultimate action from this council as a legislative measure, of what do we do with these laws? Do you make them secondary offenses, like a seatbelt law, meaning that you cannot pull someone over or stop them unless there's another offense present, not just this offense? Obviously, we have to balance public safety, because when you look at some traffic laws, for example, like running a red light or failing to use a stop sign, we probably would put that on the high end of public safety and want to make sure that we do not make something like that a secondary offense. I know in my time since joining council in 2011, and then to become council president and the city attorney, whether I was visiting Black churches or I was in barbershops or simply in community meetings, I heard time and time again, primarily from Black men, about those stops with police that they had a negative impression about. And I think this really gets at the heart of what the genesis and reasons for those stops were. Many of them, if not all, have to do with traffic, bicycle, and pedestrian laws. So looking at what data we have and can be provided from the clerk's office in a 3-year look back of who is stopped based on race, trying to get that information in the clerk's office, then doing a deep dive of each individual specific traffic, pedestrian, or bicycle law, and to make a determination of how we want those laws enforced in the city of Columbus. Ultimately, that potentially could be a council change. There are mirroring language in the Ohio Revised Code in a very similar way that we have with marijuana, where we have a Columbus City Code that has a civil penalty, but Ohio Revised Code that still makes it a misdemeanor. We have to make a determination if we do change the law on the City of Columbus side, working with the Division of Police on how that's ultimately enforced, because there still is an Ohio Revised Code that can be out there. So to sum up, Commissioner, our goal really is to take this anecdotal evidence that I've heard from a lot of folks, primarily people of color, primarily Black men, and we look at that in the real world impact those interactions have that degrade and erode what we're trying to build, which is community trust and positive interactions between law enforcement and the citizens that they patrol and enforce laws against.
Thank you for that. I mention it because I think it's an important connection to the community, through, and it can go either way. It can be a friendly stop, and with warnings if necessary, or it can go bad. And we know stories about how traffic stops, however innocent they might appear, how they can escalate into something that we don't want to see. So hopefully it's not a big, I know they're all important, but I think this one is worth the review.
Commissioner, I appreciate you saying that, because when I look at the 8 reforms that we put forward, 2 things come to mind as it relates to this particular effort. The first is any city in the United States can perform this review. This is not something that's just unique to the City of Columbus. It can be done anywhere. So there really is a potential national impact that the City of Columbus can lead the way on as it relates to a review of pedestrian, bicycle, and traffic laws. And the second is, I think that from an impact standpoint, based on what you just said, Commissioner, it certainly has the potential to bring about the single-handedly biggest impact as it relates to reforms and interactions between the police and primarily, Black men and people of color.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, City Attorney Klein. Commissioner Jones, do you have any questions for City Attorney?
No, actually, I don't.
All right. Commissioner Kogan.
If I may say something, Mr. Dorrance, just to recognize Dr. Jones. She has been intimately involved in our staff's creation and thought processes associated with the cultural immersion piece, the training piece that is the 8th reform item on my list, and I just would like to publicly thank her. She volunteers and steps up in so many areas in our community, and she has spent time with my team to help think through what that would look like. And I just am grateful for her support and her time and effort to make this happen and make it hopefully a reality soon. So thank you, Dr. Jones.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Jones, for always serving the city. Commissioner Kogan?
No questions.
Commissioner Worley?
Yeah, I have a couple. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
We can.
Okay. All right. During the review of all of those complaints, can you give me an idea of approximately how many actual complaints came into the city attorney's office, and about how many of them were reviewed or were referred to the retired FBI agent for review, and how many were referred to Baker and Hostetler for review?
So I don't have the most up-to-date numbers. They did not come into my office. They came either to IAB or to the mayor's hotline. My office was involved in the review, but they did not come to my office. I can give the most up-to-date information to the council to pass along to the Safety Commission. There were hundreds and hundreds of submissions, but it's important, like the context of which is you could have 50 submissions for one incident. So the initial part of this review actually was putting into buckets, trying to piece together saying, well, emails 1 through 10, 25 through 30, 57, 58, they're all related to this specific incident. So setting up a folder and moving all of that data into one folder. So we had various angles associated with, instance 1. The same could be true for instance 2. We could have received 100 emails, some of which are duplicates, and some of the same sort of Twitter or Facebook videos or live videos that people were taken from people's cell phone. So the initial review was really taking all of the information and classifying it to the instances rather than individual allegations. So I don't want the public to think that there were 700 individual allegations as much as there were hundreds of emails and say a couple dozen incidences. So we had to take the several hundred emails and put them into their respective buckets and identify duplicates, because like I said, some people saw things on the internet, they had their own footage and they submitted those, and so it was multiple submissions for the same incident.
City Attorney Klein, I don't want us to lose sight of, and I think we often do this, even as we do this work, is that even though there may be one victim, the trauma of experiencing that is never measured. And so imagine a person sitting on their porch watching people being abused in that way by people entrusted with protecting and serving. And so how do we measure that? How do we measure I didn't get thousands, but I got dozens of calls the days leading up to after May 30th from children downtown running in fear of their lives. There was a couple calls that in the middle of the night, late at night, I called a couple council members to help me respond or to seek someone that could make a real-time decision about, please stop chasing kids through the street. And so I don't know how we measure that. And no, they don't have physical scars, but what happens to a child that experiences that? And we cannot lose sight of that.
I understand your point, Commissioner, and I don't know how we measure that either, especially in the backdrop of a pandemic and school and rec centers being closed and opportunities for employment being gone. It's holistic trauma for everyone, certainly as well as those that were down at the protests. I will say, I think the fact that we did receive so many submissions is evidence that people were affected by what they saw.
Yes.
Thank you, City Attorney Klein. I believe
the previous commissioner, I hope I answered her question. If she has any follow-up, I'll be happy to take that as well.
But yeah, what I would like to know, and you may not have the answer now, is just how many incidents were referred to both the FBI agent and to the attorney's office.
We'll get that information to the Safety Commission as soon as possible.
Thank you. I don't believe we have any other commissioners with us this evening who has not had an opportunity. If I am wrong, please speak up now, because the way my screen is organized right now, I don't have everyone's picture up. Is there any other commissioners that would like to ask a question of City Attorney Klein or a follow-up? Hearing none, I would like to turn the mic over to Chair Mitch Brown to introduce our next presenter.
Thank you, Councilmember Dorns. I'd like to introduce the Safety Director, Ned Pettis Jr., and also accompanying him will be Chief Tom Quinlan, and also, if I'm not mistaken, Deputy Chief Greg Bacher, who has responsibility and oversees the administrative subdivision. They are going to discuss the issues associated with the Internal Affairs Bureau and the complaint investigation process. So with that, I'll turn it over to Director Pettis.
Thank you, President Harden, Safety Chair Mitch Brown, members of Council, City Attorney Zach Klein, and Commissioners. It is an honor and a privilege to be here and to answer any questions or be as helpful as I possibly can be. I would like to provide an answer to Commissioner Worley before I turn it over to Chief Quinlan. As of yesterday, the report that I received is that we have received 989 emails to the Mayor's Action Line. They are still reviewing those emails, but so far, 15 complaints have been referred to Rick Wozniak, the retired FBI agent, and 28 cases have been referred to Baker Hostetler for administrative investigations. But be mindful that there are still reviewing and sorting through those emails. They have not all been sorted through. I don't know how many they still have to review as of yet, but that was the latest report that I received yesterday. So unless you have specific questions for me, I would like to bring Chief Quinlan to the podium so that he can answer whatever questions you might have. Okay, Chief Quinlan.
Good evening, Council President Harden and members of the council. Thank you for your time today. And I'm here to answer your questions and provide some insight and overview into the internal affairs process as it has been and as it is evolving this year, as I have already implemented changes following last year's reorganization and this year's retreat, executive staff retreat, which was May 6, 7, 8, and 11. We implemented substantive changes to the process there. So with that in mind, I'll be happy to answer questions.
Chief Quinlan, I have a question. A lot has happened in the last few weeks. To hear these numbers, 989 emails, 28 admin reviews or referrals, 15. I mean, it's staggering. And, I thank you and all of us as commissioners and city leadership that we are taking this serious. But we sat through the commission the first round. And along that process, we were told, and I think we all walked away confident that you were beginning to implement change. And you assured us that we were on the right track. So my question would be, how did we get here? I still wonder, how did we get here when for 22 months, we looked at most times almost an internal scrubbing of policing as opposed to really kind of talking about the things we wanted to see. And so it staggers me that we were sure that everything was in place, that things were being implemented, that there were safeguards in place, and now we are here. And so my question is, for you, do you feel that it is just a lack of follow through, which I always thought there's no way to hold people accountable to the things that you train and bring to these city employees as police officers? But I'm really confused about how did we get here after being convinced and actually we ended our work being told that all these things were in place and that we were on the right track. And so that would be my question to you today.
Thank you, Commissioner. So there's two things in play here. One is the policy and changes the reforms we're making, both following the commission recommendations, following the matrix recommendations, and now as we're dealing with the current crisis and city attorney's office recommendations or changes, directions he's given as our attorney, changes needed. So there's a lot of policy things going on. The other part of your question is on dispositions. How are we with the volume of complaints and interactions that the public's finding problematic that they're bringing to our attention for investigation? As a decision maker in the Division of Police, just like Director Pettis, I have to wait for the investigation to run its course. The investigation that has been sent to Baker Hostetler, I don't have information on those. I have not been made aware of which ones have been referred or what evidence is there, and the same with the criminal. So being the decision maker, I have to wait until an investigation is done and that there's evidence presented, and then with evidence of sustained misconduct, you can assure that I will take action, as I have in every other case where there's sustained misconduct. Those are the two areas.
I want to have a follow-up, Chief. And I understand that we have to let due process run its course. But much like a coach, at the end of the game, you pat your players on your back and you say, good game. And so looking at these videos, and I don't know if you've seen them all, I think as a human being, you have to be willing to say, I'm not proud, or I am proud, or we could do something better. I think that's what the public is looking for us to say. To say that even though we have to let these investigations play out in due process, everything that I've seen, and I'm sure many of the council members and people in the public have seen someone, and I think they're looking for you in leadership and public safety to say, we didn't do a good job here, and now let us figure that out. I think too often it's so easy for us to say, let it run its course. And many of us, me included, wait patiently for it to run its course. But we never hear anybody take accountability for what happened in the city of Columbus that we all love.
I certainly appreciate the question and the follow-up. Let me say this, and I feel confident saying this publicly. I am actually very proud of every one of our officers handling these situations. Let me explain why. These officers, number one, under COVID, all they had to do is say that they didn't feel well, and they were completely carte blanche, allowed to stay home. They didn't have to come to work. That's very different than most every case we've ever had in the Division of Police in our history. We've never had a situation where we couldn't just come to work. All they had to do is say they didn't feel well, and they didn't have to come to work. Every officer, we had some of the lowest mark-off rates we've ever had in our history. Officers went out there day in and day out for 20 hours a day sometimes. They were at work, not always deployed, but they were at work for long hours under very difficult conditions and thousands upon thousands of encounters. And they handled themselves very admirably. I'm very proud of them. Did we get everything right? I don't know the outcome of the investigation yet, but I can tell you, probably not. When you have thousands upon thousands of encounters and you have two different people acting in a confrontational situation, you saw, because you were there, you saw what was going on. There's no way to get everything right. It's imperfect people dealing with imperfect circumstances with not full information. It's a difficult situation. If we didn't get it right, the investigations will show that, and we'll take action to correct it. One, we will hold officers accountable. Two, we'll fix training and policy so we do better and meet your expectations better in the future. But in the meantime, these officers are still coming to work, still going out there, putting themselves in danger. They're being followed home. They're being threatened online. There's a lot, and they're still coming here to protect you and every other citizen in the Division of the City of Columbus. I'm very proud of that.
I have to respond. I'm sorry, and I have to, but there's a difference in that. The people that were in the street do not get paid to protect and serve anyone. And yes, the officer took a risk in the middle of a public health epidemic, but every person that came, including City Council President Shannon Harding and myself and others on May 30th, were there because they were volunteering their time on a Saturday to take a stand against something that's just. And so you have to weigh it equally. Yes, the officers, but they were being paid. They were on the clock being paid by the city. We were there as volunteers and people that love our community, and there's a big difference in that. And so people sacrifice themselves to come downtown and be pepper sprayed. And so for me, and maybe it's just my feeling, but those two things don't compare because those people were at work doing a job that they're trained to do. And so I just have to put that on the record that there's no comparison there. Because I was there, I don't get paid to stand up and speak on Saturday. I was doing that to care about my city.
Thank you, Commissioner. To make sure that we have an opportunity, I appreciate those questions of the chief and certainly your comments there. I want to make sure that we get to the other commissioners' questions and try to, and I certainly understand the discussion at hand here. We're continuing to focus on why we're here tonight, which is to talk about the structures of civilian oversight and how that play out within our community, which is important for, I think, Commissioner, what you're talking about to how we move forward as a city. And I don't want to diminish in any way what you're talking about, but I want to try and keep the focus certainly as much as we can, what we need to do moving forward. So I want to give an opportunity to the other commissioners to ask the chief specifically around either oversights in response to the Safety Advisory Commission's report and steps that have been taken before we get to the council members' questions for the chief. Other members of the
commission.
And I apologize, I can't, so feel free to speak up.
Hi, this is Commissioner Emily Buster. Just a quick question, and I'm not sure if this is, again, the right question for the chief, but I know at one point there was a discussion about a forward-facing entity where we can see the status of each recommendation and sort of where it's in the process. And I just sort of wonder getting that out to the public.
Thank you very much. Deputy Chief of Staff, Body actually sent me asked me for, if we're ready to go live with that. We have the dashboard designed, have information ready to go. There have been, without making excuses, there have been so many things going on right now, so many balls in the air. And then this weekend, of course, we have another major event coming up that I spent all day planning to make sure we are able to respond to that. So it's within days of being ready to be forward facing, and we're ready to put that out. First stage. The second stage, I want to put out additional initiatives and actions being taken, projects in play in the Division of Police. So you have a look at that. I also want to put out recruiting information and what our progress is made for developing diversity through the ranks and through the hiring process. So there's quite a few items on that dashboard that we want to put out so the public is more informed. But the Safety Commission's recommendation, it should be very soon. There's a lot of balls in there right now. I'm just trying to get it finalized to go live.
And will that include the matrix report recommendations as well?
Yes, ma'am. Both of them are included.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Other members of the commission? Hearing none, I'd like to allow the opportunity for council members to ask any questions of Chief Quinlan. Councilmember Brown?
Yeah, Rob, I'd like to ask the chief to explain the organizational structure associated with the Internal Affairs Bureau and the role that the chief plays with regards to that process.
Yes, thank you very much, sir. So in many years past, let's just say for the last decade, longer than that, but I have stats for the last decade, the Internal Affairs was a direct report to the chief of police, and the process was an investigation with leave Internal Affairs, go to the chain of command, and to the deputy chief, unless there was critical misconduct, and go to the chief of police. Last year, during the reorganization, I created Public Accountability Subdivision and put Deputy Chief Richard Bash, our Senior Deputy Chief, in charge of that, which is the Internal Affairs. It is the Professional Standards Bureau, which also involves discipline grievance, and our CLIA accreditation. It involves fiscal and human resources. So all of our public accountability items, each one of those areas we cover is headed by a bureau commander. I made that change again, so there was greater oversight, greater opportunity for, as opposed to the chief having intimate knowledge of something coming up through and maybe developing pre-drawn conclusions, placing the public accountability. That person then also has the ability to do more hands-on oversight and make sure it sticks with timelines. In fact, we've reduced our timelines down. We were at 57 days on a complaint. We've got it down to 41 days. We'd like to get it down lower, of course. But so we're working, making progress there. So that's kind of how that process works. And then I've made several other substantive changes this year after the retreat that are in progress. In the past, the Internal Affairs Sergeant, we have 19 sergeants assigned to Internal Affairs. They have no subordinates. All they do is handle administrative investigations. So they're never investigating someone that works for them. And in fact, if they have worked for them, there's 18 other investigators that could be assigned to. We have 2 lieutenants. We have 4 administrative sergeants who just take complaint calls and screen the calls and write the complaints up and assign them out from there. And we have a bureau commander. So in the past, we were just investigating citizen complaints. And of the citizen complaints, for instance, last year, we received out of, again, keep in mind, we have 1,200,000 citizen interaction calls for service a year, 27,000 arrests. You take 2,700 weapons, firearms off violent felons in the field in yearly. And of those, we had 236 citizen complaints of misconduct alleged against police officers last year. Of those investigations, most of them are not as much about what the officer did, but how the officer treated them. So 16 to 17% of them are based on the treatment alone. That's the whole complaint. 7% of them, 8% of them are based off of force. So of the 236, only 41 complaints were about the level of force an officer used. That gives you just a little bit of insight into where we spend our time. And the rest of them are misconduct of a variety of reasons. So two different levels. One's a citizen complaint, and another's an administrative investigation. Let's say, for instance, an officer reports that they were arrested over the weekend for drunk driving. That would go to internal affairs. They would conduct an administrative investigation. We get a complaint of some type of possible criminal conduct. We'll look at that. If we decide that it is criminal, we'll send it for criminal investigation. Otherwise, we'll handle it administratively. If we do a criminal after it's over, then we handle it administratively for non-becoming conduct or other rule of conduct violation. So those are kind of how we handle the cases historically. This year, I'm making some changes to how we do force investigations and citizen complaint investigations. The chain of command always investigated force investigations up to a police-involved shooting or a death in custody. That would go to our critical incident response team. So now those are going to DCI, and the investigations of force are now going to be handled at a level 4, which means punch, kick, or strike, a baton, a dog bite, one of those higher levels of force will be investigated by internal affairs. Again, that takes it out of the chain of command where the sergeant knows the person and may have some familiarity. You're taking it to a more of a neutral, independent investigation, which internal affairs has always conducted. They will handle that. Plus, if a citizen complains about the force, right now, the internal affairs was handling the citizen complaint on the force, and the chain of command handled the actual force. Now we can consolidate those and we're not going redundancy in that process. In turn, I'm going to move some of the citizen complaint investigations down to the precinct sergeant, let them investigate so they know what their officers are doing. They're more engaged in what their officers, how they're interacting with citizens. You got to remember, before we really didn't have, there was a lot of times one person word against another, some witness interview. Now we have almost everything either on cruiser camera or body camera. Well, both of those things, most of these get resolved with the complainant by coming in and watching the video, and it's either we can prove the officer did what they were accused of doing, it's right there in the video, or we can prove they didn't. So a lot of them are really being found to either be unfounded or disproven, or proven true and disciplined. That's the process in a nutshell. I can expand on any more questions you have on that.
One more point associated with that, Chief. The proverbial driving while black, if you have an individual and you get multiple complaints, what's your process for evaluating whether or not this is something that is systemic or individual?
Very good question, sir. So a couple things are happening. Number one, in 2019, of the 236 investigations that we received, these are citizen-driven. 10 of those alleged either racist or discriminatory actions. And through investigation, through body camera, all 10 were able to be disproven or withdrawn by the complainant once they saw the videotape. That gives you a little bit of idea there. As far as the process, if there's You have to also remember, though, when you're dealing with an allegation of discriminatory actions in a traffic stop sign. One issue is you may be accused. We have to make sure we look at it right. You could be accused of stopping somebody. Let's just use the simplest of terms, jaywalking. You could say, well, I was stopped for jaywalking because of the color of my skin. And we could look at it and go, well, no, you were jaywalking. So, that's obvious you weren't. That's not so in investigations that involve bias, because bias investigation may mean, yes, it's true, you were jaywalking and you got stopped, but did the officer stop you because of the color of your skin and let the 4 people that were with you that were white go? That could show that, yes, it's true, you did jaywalk, but why? What was the motive behind the officer? That's one of the things that make those investigations a little harder, because you have to show what the motivation might have been and how the officer performed differently. So we have what's called an employee action review system, is what your question was getting at, where we look at citizen complaints and use of force. So sometimes we may find, based on a videotape, that the person was found, they did what they were accused of doing and no further action. But when you have 3 of those, and you're looking at them going, wait a minute, is there a pattern of how this officer reacts to a situation? Is there a pattern to how they react to a confrontation? Is there a pattern to whom they're stopping and what actions they're taking, who they give a ticket to, who they let go? When you start looking at patterns, then you start being able to identify behaviors and implement an action plan to correct that, provide training, or to discipline. And so we have those things in place. But what I've asked for this year is a CAD and RMS system. As I've said in every conversation I have, we need a dispatch system and a records management system. Part of that system would include an early intervention system for officers. So we're not looking at just use of force assist complaints anymore. We're going to look at how often this person changes addresses, how often the person's off sick, other things that may be red flags. Is there something more going on here that we can do an intervention with the officer and make sure we don't allow anything improper to occur? So we're looking for a more robust system, which this system we're looking at now is cloud-based. Will allow the dashboard, like we're talking about for the Matrix Recommendations Commission. We can look at a dashboard. Sergeants will have a dashboard where they can see this officer has been on 3 suicides this month, been to 2 crib deaths, 2 sit deaths with babies, been to 4 homicides and a traffic crash or whatever, and say, maybe we need to take this officer offline for a little while and give him something else to do, just to get a break and decompress. Because as Commissioner Osada said, these things can be traumatic for the public, but the public may see something one time. They may drive past a crash scene and see a fatality one time. Officers may see it 6 to 7 times in a month, whether it be a homicide, a suicide, a traffic crash. That weighs on an officer, and we have to worry about their wellness. They can't help you if they can't take care of themselves, and that's what that early intervention system is going to be designed to do.
Chief Quinlan, and I hear you, but we have our organization, Faith in Public Life, Baptist Ministers Alliance, all have submitted to your office and to public safety numerous cases of officers, and we can name them, that have, and I hear you about their mental health and their well-being. And that's very important. I'm glad that you raised that, because it worries me to death that we have officers that have killed multiple people and then been put right back in the community where they killed those people. Officer Rosen, for example, in the Henry Gearing case, went through through Ronald Bryant's office, an examination of that case. And then he was put back in the community, and I'm not sure if he's still there. I don't know, and I don't know if you're at liberty to share that. But there are several officers that we are aware of that had not only killed someone, shot dogs, all those horrible things. And I don't know where you track their mental health, because I worry about those. I know they're human beings. And not only do I worry about my community, but I worry about those officers. Because I hear you say the trauma of taking someone's life has to play on someone's mental health. And so if we are not serious about tracking that data, and I mean that, if we don't track how we demand our officers go right back to a community, recognizing that the community doesn't trust them, what does that do to that officer? I can only imagine he has to walk around in fear, but the community is in fear. And so we gotta get serious about that. We brought that to the office. It's in the recommendations. It's in the matrix report. Mental health is a real thing. And so I'm gonna stay on that subject because I sat in that commission and brought it up again and again, and we didn't want to talk about it. And so now we gotta get serious about it. Because that's serious. It can't just be mentioned and we don't have real procedures and checkpoints to make sure that we are taking care of these officers in a way that they're not being traumatized, much in the way that the Black community is traumatized and afraid and doesn't trust, because we say these things and we do nothing about them.
Okay, well, with the early intervention system is designed to allow for improvements there. But what I've done in the meantime is I've extended the number of incidents where a person involved in a critical incident must go seek counseling after a critical incident. It used to be one time, 3 days later to be cleared to return to work. Now they have 3-month and 6-month follow-ups to make sure that as time's going on that they have that resiliency built in. We also have a peer assistance team, an employee assistance team, all many different functions, chaplains program, where people do and have the options to reach out, and they do reach out. And we have significant feedback from internally that how much that is helping. We have a therapy dog program for our officers. Something as simple as that makes a big difference. Without getting into the nuts and bolts of something, you ask a question, I'll give you a direct answer. I did not put the officer you brought up back into his previous assignment. He's in a different assignment that is not on the street right now. And I don't know if you've ever read the case and know the facts of that investigation, but that case is brought up almost every time I ever talk to a community group. I encourage you, now that the case is closed, to ask for the public record and review the case. I think when you see the facts of the case, you'll have a more clear picture of what truly happened that day and why that officer was cleared by a grand jury and by a federal judge.
Chair, this is Council President Harden, Ms. Tammy, and to the police chief. Just for the sake of time, we have a subject matter expert that is actually going to get to talking about where we go, how we actually build an independent investigatory agency and body. And he taught me not to use best practices, but effective practices. And so I just want to keep us focused and keep us not focused, because this conversation is critically important, but I want to keep us moving. And so I will turn it back over to Chair Dorns to go through the council members. But this is a very important conversation, but we got to get to the other parts of it as well.
Thank you, Council President. And I agree. I think I want to try and keep the focus as much as we can on sort of why we came here tonight. And certainly we have a subject matter expert to come up here soon. Do any other council members have any questions of Chief Quinlan, specifically around IAB or the use of investigations as they currently exist within the Division of Police?
Councilor Dorns, I would like to ask the chief to elaborate on the simplicity or the complexity of how a citizen goes about filing a complaint.
Thank you, Council Member. The simplicity would be the easiest way to explain it. You may call, you may come to Internal Affairs. The phone number is 614-645-4880. You can email, you can text it in. You can actually write. We've received complaints where someone wrote on the back of a traffic ticket and they're sending it into the clerk's office to pay it, that they didn't like the way they were treated. And the clerk's office sends that to us for investigation. We take all investigations and assign them to a supervisor to investigate. It's a very simple process. We would rather take all the questions and reach out to the person and try to resolve it. In addition, this year, I'm also looking to, through seizure funds, to fund a program called mediation, where the citizen and the officer can actually sit down and speak face to face and let each other know how they felt out of that encounter. It'd be better than just getting a paper in the mail 60 days later says, we looked at this and couldn't prove or disprove the case. That doesn't really help us as much. But if they want to have a mediator, a professional mediator come in and talk it out, I think that's going to be a lot more welcome to officers and to the public. So there's a very simple process.
Chair Brown, any other questions?
No, I thank you, Councilmember Dorns. I thought it was important for everyone to understand the process with regards to how you can file a complaint, and it is also 24 hours a day, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, sir.
Okay. That's all I have, Councilmember Dorns.
Thank you. Other members of council?
Thank you, council member. I just have, this may sound very elementary, Chief, and I apologize for that, but how are our officers trained to treat people in interactions? Like, is there a portion of the academy or ongoing training about how to treat regular resident interactions? Because I do think that, in some police interactions, the stakes are very dire and it can end very badly. In others, the stakes are not as dire and they don't end badly, but they end with an impression. And that impression is what fosters or harms trust being built. And so, as basic as that sound, what kind of training do we give officers on their responsibility in being polite and deferential to residents?
Thank you, Councilmember. Appreciate the question. So every lesson plan we create, we create it around the premise of the division's core values. Core values are integrity, compassion, accountability, respect, and excellence. And each one of those speak to how we demand officers actually engage the public. In fact, I added a rule of conduct, which are our highest, most authoritative directives, that includes core values in the rule of conduct. So if you violate, we may not be able to point to a specific thing you did wrong, but if you violate a core value, you can still be disciplined for that. So I talked to every single officer. This is true for advanced training as well, but for in-service or recruit training, give you an example. As they're getting ready to graduate, I talk to every single officer and say, you can tell me what Sergeant Reardon, which everyone knows about our training academy, is Sergeant Reardon, he just retired, but I said, who can tell me what he said to you on the first day of the academy? Not a single hand goes up. No one can remember what he said. I asked him, I said, who in here can tell me how he made you feel that first day? Every hand goes up. So I try to make the point that no matter what you have to do, even if it's a negative encounter, it's still how you made someone feel. I talk about the importance of dignity. And I talk about even if you have a negative encounter with this person, there's other witnesses, other family members, other bystanders present that you can still leave a good impression with. We've gone to a community engagement model where we have over 3,000 community meetings attended a year. Just do simple math, that's almost 10 a day, every day of the year, 365 days a year, that we're going somewhere in the city, attending a formal community engagement meeting. Our Safe Streets program, 50% of the Safe Streets program is designed to have public interaction on bikes and be approachable and have those positive encounters. And every scenario that we do, we make sure we include a component of that of compassion and dealing with how to have a good resident walk away with people being thankful that the police were there. And again, I know we said we had 236 complaints. I don't have the exact number with me, but we get over 1,000 citizen compliments every year. Just like citizen complaints are formal, we ever received in writing over 1,000 citizen compliments. So it is working. Can we do more? We can always do more, but it is working.
Thank you.
Other members of council, Councilmember Favor, Councilmember Remy. President.
Yes.
All right,
I'm
sorry,
sorry.
Councilmember Favor.
I was trying to unmute fast enough. Thank you, Chief, for joining us. As you know, my office recently held a public hearing this past Monday to discuss one of the recommendations by this body, recommendation number 37, around the morality clause, as well as discussing some legislation around hate group and being affiliated with said groups. And my office has admittedly also reached out to you, Chief, for just further input. But you mentioned earlier that you receive around 10 to 15-ish complaints, IEB does, that allege some type of racist behavior. I'm not sure if I heard that number correct, but do we know of those 10? I'm sorry, that was 9?
9, yeah. 9 this year, 13 last year.
Do we know if any of those complaints have had any a form of complaint around being affiliated with a hate group? I know that a lot of council members, and myself included, have been receiving some screenshots of some disturbing behavior disturbing behavior, perhaps words that might suggest one could be affiliated with a. So just wondering if it's a pervasive issue that you see, and if so, is this something that IAB has explored already?
Sure, we're always open to look at that. No good police officer that's worth anything in my book wants to be associated with somebody that's tied to a hate group. So what I can tell you of the 9 complaints, the vast majority of those are people who feel that they were singled out or targeted because of their race. To my knowledge, none of them allege that officer behaved in any different manner based on a known or suspected affiliation with a hate group. Now, the social media posting, I think what you're referring to, I will readily admit, drives me nuts. I don't agree with or like people that can be readily identifiable as a police officer posting things. But we're working with the city attorney's office on where the boundaries are for free speech and your role as a public servant. We're working with them on trying to find that balance, take action where we can take action, hold people accountable. But as far as affiliation with a known hate group or any type of clandestine membership, we do not have any knowledge of any member involved in any such group.
Can I ask a follow-up question too? And
Commissioner Alzado, we only have a limited amount of time tonight, and I really want to get to our subject matter expert. If we can certainly make sure that question gets answered offline, if that's okay.
Whoever's chairing this, and I'm sorry I can't see all these screens.
Okay, it's Councilmember Dorrance, Commissioner.
We have to sidebar some of these things because we cannot rush past them, and I won't be rushed past this subject. It's too important. And so sidebar or however you need to get to that answer, because the complaints we got to talk about because nobody's filing them. That's why you only have that number, because they don't trust the process. So put that on the record, and then let's talk about it in a real way.
Thank you, Commissioner. Martin, do you have any questions for the chief?
Mr. Chair, is it all right if I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Chief. Chief, do you know the breakdown of investigations that are internal? And by internal, I mean police to police versus citizen to police?
I have a full report here with me. I have to look up real quick to get it.
And maybe not to break down like numbers, but how much of IAB's time is spent on internal police to police functions versus community to police?
Well, getting 236 complaints by citizens. but there are more investigations that are done. It looks like last year was 70.8% for citizen complaints. So just say 71% citizen complaints, 29% internal generated complaints. And I have some breakdown on the discipline that resulted from many of those. Just the numbers I have in front of me over the last 10 years, 313 cases were reviewed for departmental charges, which resulted with 67% resulting in a departmental charge, which means suspension or termination that I would forward to the Director of Public Safety. So it just gives you a little bit of an indication over 10 years. There's been 313 cases reviewed and 67% resulted in that. We've had internal investigations in 2019. We actually had 24 internal investigations with 236 being civilian. 6 of them involved criminal misconduct. 3 were unbecoming conduct or insubordination. There were some EEO investigations that were involved race or retaliation or gender, or hostile work environment, and a couple involved untruthfulness.
Thank you, Chief. And I'm asking that question because I know as part of the Safety Commission's review, they brought up some kind of staggering numbers around police to police issues, and some of the interviews that they did with the police officers, primarily officers of color, spoke of some concern around even reporting and the number of those. So that was my first question. I appreciate that answer. My second question is, I've been around just long enough to remember that, and Chief and Councilmember Brown might be able to remind me of this. Several years ago, maybe a decade ago, there was a conversation about civilian review, civilian oversight. It certainly was not the conversation that we're having today, but I just wondered if you remember the basics of what that conversation was, because if I can remember correctly, and I was just a kid staffer back then, there were, it did bring people to the table. I think the FOP was on that, the NAACP and folks were a part of it, but there was almost an agreement to something like 10 years ago, if I'm not correct. I just wonder if you remember the basis of that conversation for us, just as a level set of where we came from. So as we talk about where we may go.
Councilmember Mitch Brown might be able to refresh my memory. As I recall, there was one thing derailed that. I can't remember off the top of my head what the one item. Everything was pretty much an agreement, and there was one area that was insurmountable, I guess, and derailed the whole conversation. I'm not sure if Councilmember Brown can refresh my memory on that.
The conversation again, Council President, and for the Chief, yes, the conversation did center around trying to establish a civilian review, but we ran into a variety of different hurdles with the union regarding how it was going to be implemented. I have to look them. I still have my records from those days, so I can still pull them up and refer to all that. But we had made significant progress in that respect, and I think now, as a segue into Mr. Carr's presentation, times have changed. The will to move forward with a civilian review, I think, is far more palatable, and the methodologies of how we go about making it happen are more significant right now. So I'm open-minded, and that's why I want to hear from Mr. Carr about the areas around the country who have civilian reviews. Some have been effective, some have not been as effective as people would like. And what are the ingredients to make sure that what we proceed to initiate here in Columbus is an effective tool for the chief, but also an effective tool for the community, and certainly with the involvement of this council.
Thank you, Chair Brown. Council President, do you have any more questions?
I'm done.
Thank you. Chief, I just have two quick questions for you, then we're going to get to our last speaker. So one, could you talk about how, obviously, when you talk about the numbers of folks that are assigned to IAB, how do folks get recruited into those offices? Is that or do folks ask for that assignment? Is there a length of time that people typically stay there? Could you just talk a little bit about how that bureau is structured from a personnel standpoint, and why or why not people may be there for a certain amount of time or anything like that? Could you just talk a little bit about that for us?
Sure. So our assignment transfer policy that's tied to our collective bargaining agreement kind of controls that. There was a time back in 2001 where the chief was given the authority to handpick a portion of investigators at their discretion, and then others were based on seniority. There was also a time where it was a requirement that you had more than 6 months as a supervisor before you could have that position. So you were more experienced supervisor and investigator. Those have since, I believe, my knowledge, been bargained away as far as how we currently fill those. Now they're strictly based on assignment transfer, seniority based. A lot of times we see people sometimes less than 6 months on take those jobs. That's not always a bad thing. My personal opinion is I think every supervisor in the division should do a cycle through internal affairs. It should be limited to maybe 6 months or a year, but they should all get the experience to talk to citizens and hear the fact that sometimes good people do bad things, sometimes good officers do bad things. And so sometimes when they hear from citizens and they get it investigated from a neutral look, they're not in the chain of command, they're outside that, they get actually hear from what officers do. Sometimes it just kind of baffles everybody. I think that is helpful to develop a supervisor when you're looking at things in review of the chain of command to say, you know what, this is wrong and I have to call it out as wrong. I think that'll actually make for better supervisors. So if there were changes to be made to the collective bargaining agreement regarding how we assign personnel to internal affairs, I would like to have some say in how many people how I control how many people is who we have there, at least a number that I depend on for the most critical of circumstances, the most critical investigations, and also if there should be a cap. I think that's certainly something to be considered. We have other jobs where there's a 5-year limit before you have to cycle out. And sometimes developing a lot of experience is good. Other times, once you do something I took the job I used to be the discipline grievance chair for the chief of police when I was a lieutenant, and I handled terminations. As Councilmember Brown knows, the discipline grievance that resulted in suspensions and terminations. I left the job after about 2.5 years. It wasn't because it wasn't an important job or it wasn't needed done. I took this job to help people and make a difference in the community, and someone needs to hold officers accountable. I chose to go back to the street and make a difference, as opposed to handle the terminations and always see the negativity, deal with officers. But I think that helps officers also. Sometimes you deal with all the negativity in policing, you forget there's good people out there. When you deal with internal affairs, you see all the negativity alleged against officers. Sometimes you forget there's good officers. I think we need to start looking at a new model, a new system of rotating people through.
Thank you, Chief. The last question I have for you is specifically about, again, the structure of complaints, and I think some of the commissioners have spoke to this. Does IAB initiate complaints, or are they reacting to citizen complaints? Do they have the ability, if they see or hear of something, whether that's on social media or otherwise, do they have the ability to initiate an investigation on their own?
Oh, there's two different ways of looking at something. There's one, events as observed or events as reported. And any supervisor, if they observe misconduct, can refer that case for an investigation either by the chain of command, or it would come up through the deputy chief who would send it to internal affairs. Typically, IA is designed to be a reactive investigative unit. They handle what's assigned to them. Our professional standards bureau, we have inspections, lieutenants, that go out and proactively look to try to catch officers doing things right, but if they catch things being done wrong, they can address that as well. I also created an FBI Public Corruption Task Force. I had a sergeant who spent many years in internal affairs and in criminal investigation. I also assigned an officer who has done years of criminal investigation to the FBI Public Corruption Task Force. Those two positions are a direct report to me. I assign them proactively to do investigations where they may go out and follow an officer to see if they're working special duty while they're on the clock for the city. I look for things that I can assign them to make sure they're not abusing sick leave and pain and illness. There's ways I can use that Public Corruption Task Force proactively to make sure officers are staying in line with core values and rules of conduct.
Thank you, Chief. Do any of the council members have any last questions for the chief before I let him go? Seeing none, thank you, Chief, for joining us tonight. And with that, I'd like to introduce our next presenter, Brian Corr, who's been very patient with us tonight. So thank you, Brian. He is the immediate past president of the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. He's joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts. The NACOL is a nonprofit organization that works to enhance fair and professional law enforcement response to community needs, increase accountability and transparency in policing, and build trust through civilian oversight. Brian has worked as the executive secretary for the Police Review and Advisory Board of the City of Cambridge, Massachusetts, and since September as the executive director of the city's Peace Commission since 2008. The Police Review and Advisory Board is the city's civilian oversight agency, while the Peace Commission works with other municipal agencies, communities of faith, nonprofit organizations, and the community as a whole to build connections and strengthen relationships, promote positive dialogue, and foster understanding, and coordinate compassionate community responses to support recovery and healing in the wake of traumatic events and violence affecting Cambridge and its residents. Brian is widely recognized as an expert in this field, and I'm certainly looking forward to his presentation this evening. So Brian, thank you for being patient with us tonight, and the floor is yours.
All right, you're very, very welcome, Councilmember Doran. So again, thank you all for having me here. I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm going to share some slides in just a moment, and I'm going to be very transparent that I use lots of these different interfaces to make presentations, and this one is a little different. So we're going to see if I can get my screen sharing working again. We tried it out and it worked okay. So let's see. Hopefully, let's see. Okay, great. I can see what you can see, and you're seeing the right thing. So again, Brian Corr, National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. I really am honored to be able to speak to the council members and to the members of the commission. It's such an important time to be talking about these issues, so I always have more to say than I have time for, so I'm going to do my best to be brief, and I may whip through some of these slides quickly, but I will definitely make this presentation available through the staff that I've been working with to get here today. So the first thing I want to share is, and this was something that came up in my mind earlier today. If you look at these newspaper articles, they're from 1962, and it's about a Negro co-ed, a black woman who was a student at Ohio State, who was arrested for jaywalking. I won't go through the whole article, but you can see, if you had a chance to read it, you could see that she was with two white women who were not arrested, and when she was being arrested, she was actually being put into the police wagon, and a white man, Mike Devonsky, came along and jaywalked so he would get arrested too, because he felt that, as he says, I thought it was one of the most unfair and most discriminatory acts I had seen in my life. It was against my moral upbringing. The NAACP took on the case, and the reason I know about this case, and I have these weird pictures, is because that's my mom. I'm from Detroit. My mom grew up in Hamilton. She was a student at Ohio State, and this is something she never talked about really until the last few years. She just turned 80 this year, and so she shared this, I had never seen these newspaper clippings or these newspapers or anything like that. So in a sense, this may seem like ancient history. It's a long time ago. It's a jaywalking case. And yet I felt that I wanted to share this so you can see that these things really do reverberate through generations. Even though my mom never talked about this, when she really told me this, it explained some things to me that I had always kind of wondered about that she didn't say much about. So just to give you this context that this is personal for me in a way, and it's also professional. I've been doing civilian oversight since 2010 and have been involved in NACOL from the very beginning. So I've already taken up a lot of time on the first slide, so let me jump ahead to the more formal presentation. So we talk about policing a lot right now, and there's a lot of conversation about, well, what is policing? So the standard narrative is what you see on your screen, that this is something we imported from England. You know, it's people in a community, constables, a county sheriff, walking around, checking things out, making sure that the sleepy town is safe at night. And as this quote says, these organized practices were adapted to the colonies from England and formed the foundations of American law enforcement. There's a lot of truth in that. There's also a lot of truth in what we've heard about much more recently, which is the role of slave patrolling in the history of American policing. This is a slave patrol results from just under 200 years ago, that I do swear that I will, as searcher for guns, swords, and other weapons among the slaves in my district, faithfully and as privately as I can discharge the trust reposed in me as the law directs to the best of my power, so help me God. It's an important thing to know, but again, it's not the whole story. Something that we also hear about a lot, especially when we're looking at kind of the field of policing, is Sir Robert Peel. And the police are the public and the public are the police. That this is the foundation of policing in our country, that police are really just members of our community who've been given this special task, but they're really just doing what all of us should do, which is make sure that we keep our community safe and do our best to prevent crime. The goal was not to prevent crime, was not to catch criminals, but to prevent crime. And that's also true. So as we think about the history of policing, all of that is there, but it says something about why we need oversight. And again, I don't want to read slides on the screen, but some form of civilian oversight, I would say, and our organization would say, is important in every community. And now, on a certain level, the fact that you have elected officials who hire and appoint a police chief or police commissioner, that's a form of civilian oversight, but we're really talking about something that's closer to the day-to-day working of the police. And it varies greatly. One of the themes of our work is that there are almost 200 civilian oversight agencies around the country. No two are identical, which makes sense because we have a lot of law enforcement agencies that vary greatly. And that it's not enough to gain legitimacy, but in many, many communities of every size, it's very hard to gain legitimacy without having some form of civilian oversight, civilian engagement. Something as well that has gotten a lot of attention, although not as much the last 3 years, is the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. If you have not had a chance to look at it, I recommend everybody should, whether you're law enforcement, community member, elected official, everyone should look through it. There's an executive summary. There's also a set of an implementation guide. It's written in a way that you can dig into detail or you can just read the high level pieces. But as it says here, there were 6 pillars. One that is of particular interest, of course, is policy and oversight. I'll mention parenthetically that officer safety and wellness are also very important. And it's something I have a personal focus on in looking at the role of trauma in policing, in the community, and in police-community relations. So as people were saying, it's a sidebar for another conversation, but I would be more than happy to share information about how we look at the role of trauma and how we can support the police department in dealing with the trauma that their officers undergo, in understanding the trauma that community members face, and the interaction of those things. In that report, the 21st Century Report, it talked about policies reflecting community values and that law enforcement agencies need to work with communities to develop policies and strategies. I don't know the details of how that works in Columbus. Clearly, there's work that happens together, but that is one of the essentials for having an effective policing situation, but also to be able to have effective civilian oversight. And the task force guide actually, their implementation guide actually specifically mentioned NACOL, noted that there's a huge range of types of oversight. Some simply review complaints and investigations that are completed by the police department. Some investigate, some do really the role of an inspector general. So I'll say a little bit more about that as we go along. But one thing I really want to talk about that was highlighted in the 21st Century Task Force report is procedural justice and the tied-in idea of legitimacy. And these are important both for law enforcement and for oversight. So the 4 pillars of procedural justice are voice, people being able to have an opportunity to be heard, to feel like they're really being listened to, and we can think about that in encounters big and small. Neutrality, to believe that things are being done fairly, in an unbiased way, with trust. The quality of treatment that people receive, that they really feel that they're being treated with dignity and respect, and that they have trust, that they really believe that the police officers are concerned about them and the community and are there to do and want to do what's right. Now, procedural justice is very tied to this idea of legitimacy. And legitimacy is really much more about why people listen to the police, why people call the police when there's a problem, why they trust the police to the extent that they do. And legitimacy comes from many sources. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment as well. But again, when we think about legitimacy, one of the main things that creates it is people being treated in a procedurally just way. And it really takes sustained, deliberate, thoughtful effort. It's more than a policy, it's more than values, it's more than something that gets read at roll call once a quarter. It really is about everything that's done around policing and law enforcement. And so what is legitimacy? People believe the police are trustworthy, honest, concerned about the well-being, but it means that people think that the authority of police should be accepted, that their authority is right and justified, that they should comply with police instructions, and that they should accept the decisions of the police, even if they don't always agree, because overall, they believe that the police are legitimate in their community. But it's also true for civilian oversight. And within policing, there's been an ongoing conversation about legitimacy and procedural justice, and I've been one of the people that's been also pushing that conversation within civilian oversight. And in some ways, I think it's a little more challenging for oversight because we have multiple stakeholders. We have all the same stakeholders that the police department has, but we also have the police as stakeholders, because if the police department does not feel that civilian oversight is legitimate, you will have situations that we often hear about where, well, oversight has failed, oversight has not been effective. And if there is not cooperation, that can easily happen. And one of the things that is parallel for us in oversight is that, we were hearing the chief say a little bit about internal affairs. It's very important inside a department that officers feel that there is procedural justice, that they are treated in a way that's fair. And in a paramilitary organization, that can be challenging, but it's really important. So it's also important for oversight as we're doing investigations, as we're releasing findings, as we're conducting interviews with people, that people feel that we're treating them with procedural justice. The next topic I want to talk about quickly is the types of authority. And this is a growing field where we're looking at, where does the authority come from? Does it come from the ordinance? Does it come from the law? Does it come from your ability to show up and do things and not have any problems afterward, not have any accountability? Or does it come from the community expectations and values? Does it come from connecting with people, doing outreach? Does it come from changing the conditions that lead to problematic conduct, whether it's misconduct or even just conduct that wasn't considered optimal? And how do you measure the success of that? These are different models of authority. And again, they're relevant for law enforcement, but also for civilian oversight. And I'll just say parenthetically, I'm saying a lot of this to help all of you as leaders in the community and decision makers think about a framework as you're looking at models, proposals, ordinances, provisions, how to operationalize things, staffing. All of these things should kind of be in the back of your mind. Let's see, and this is some weird glitch, but okay, good. So another concept that comes up a lot is lawful but awful. This may not be as common outside of policing, but as it says here, there may have been no violation of policy, the officers are cleared, but something still went wrong. People felt badly about the interaction or something even worse. And so one of the issues that we've looked at a lot in oversight is moving from just looking at back-end accountability, what went wrong, how did it go wrong, who's being held accountable, to front-end accountability. How do we make sure that the training is in place? How do we make sure that the systems internally are in place to improve outcomes? And again, I say this from the perspective of civilian oversight. Law enforcement agencies, I think, are also thinking about these things, and they must and they need to. But as civilian oversight, to the extent that this is something a specific ordinance allows you to do, empowers you to do, the civilian oversight agency should also be looking at these issues. Because just like everything else, it's a lot better to prevent problems than to go in and figure out why the problem occurred and what can we do to keep it from happening next time. How do we prevent it at the front end? And I won't go into this too much just for the sake of time, but at the New York University School of Law, there's a professor named Barry Friedman who's done some really interesting work on front-end accountability and has been trying to create some models around the country with limited success to engage communities in a conversation about what kind of policing they want, and then have that directly influence the kind of policies and procedures and training and activities that police departments are undertaking in their communities. So let's see, I'm doing okay. I'm about halfway, a little more than halfway through with my slides. That's good. So I want to say a little bit about the field that we're looking at. So the facts of the field: law enforcement, 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the United States. No two are exactly alike, whether you're talking about in an area like Central Ohio, a state, a region of the country. There are different types of law enforcement agencies. And most of those law enforcement agencies in big cities do have civilian oversight, but not all. Right now, the largest city in the country that doesn't have oversight is Phoenix. I think it's of the 10 largest cities, I believe. It's the only one that doesn't have civilian oversight. But there are 18,000 law enforcement departments and agencies, so they don't all have civilian oversight. As we think about the police departments, they vary greatly. And again, people know this, I won't belabor this, but you've got giant departments like New York City and Los Angeles, and you have tons of departments in every state and almost every county that may have 2 or 3 officers, 5 or 6 officers, very limited training budget. So you have to really look at the situation in each community as you're thinking about oversight. And that's part of why when we talk about oversight, there are about 160 oversight agencies as opposed to 18,000 law enforcement agencies. Again, no two are exactly alike. Most cities of decent size have them. More and more are starting civilian oversight agencies. Many of these began in reaction to specific incidents of police misconduct or scandals. Sometimes it's more about a long-term system of problems that never got to that one really horrific case. And under the previous presidential administration, civilian oversight was being featured prominently in a lot of the settlement agreements, the consent decrees that were coming out after civil rights investigations by the DOJ. Not really happening right now, but probably at some point in the future that will continue. And again, thinking about how civilian oversight has existed and changed, I want to say a little bit about what I started to say, the idea of how does it happen? Well, traditionally it's been reactive. Again, I won't read through the whole thing, but something happens, you start an agency, it looks at specific complaints, it may look at policies based on the complaints. It really is this model of almost policing the police, or a judicial model. And one of the ideas is really that, well, if people know they'll be held accountable, that will stop misconduct. So it relies on deterrence. As civilian oversight is evolving, and more places have been doing it for more and more years, the agency I work for goes back to 1984, they become increasingly proactive. And what we've seen is more and more cities around the country either revamping their oversight so that it has more of a proactive element, or when they create civilian oversight, looking at things like what are the underlying issues and causes, really analyzing data, looking at preventing misconduct, really building partnerships with law enforcement, and working to build bridges between law enforcement and the wider community. It's something, again, most law enforcement agencies work to do that, but civilian oversight can have an important role in almost being a translator, a communicator between what unfortunately are too often two separate camps. And oversight with the training that people get, both board members and staff members, commission members, whatever the form may be, can really help people to see the other side, to understand the other perspective. And that's a big part of what I do in my work in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I imagine people want to know a little bit more about what does the structure look like, what are the types of oversight, and I'll start by just saying a quick sense of how we define oversight at NACOL. It's really any entity that's investigating, auditing, reviewing internal law enforcement investigations or complaints. They could be doing monitoring of policies, procedures, management, training, supervision, but they can also be doing investigations themselves that are completely separate from the law enforcement agency. In some places, we actually have seen where the Internal Affairs Bureau and professional standards are taken out of the police department and run by civilians with sworn officers as part of the staffing and investigation. So there are tons of different ways of doing it, but it is basically about having people who are not sworn police officers who are part of anything from a specific complaint to broad policy and systemic reviews. And there are three main models people talk about. You can find this on the internet. The review focus model, the investigation focus model, and the monitor, auditor, or inspector general model. Again, I could say tons about all these different things. From what I've heard, it sounds as though Columbus, you're considering an investigation focus model, which is, I'd say, very common. Review focus models are often in smaller communities where there aren't that many complaints, and it doesn't really seem to rise to the level of having to hire investigators that work outside of the police department. But some larger cities have a review model. Investigation focus models, kind of obvious. You're doing investigations. You have trained investigators. They may have come out of law enforcement. They may have been private investigators. They may have some other background, auditors, and they're doing investigations. They're interviewing officers. They're interviewing complainants. They're looking through files and materials, looking at video evidence, again, with training and continuing education. And then the monitor, auditor, inspector general, again, sort of what it sounds like. It's really looking much more at systemic issues. And then, I won't say a ton about that. And then finally, you see on your screen hybrid models, because increasingly cities are developing models where either there are multiple agencies, but more often where an agency has multiple functions. So my own relatively small agency in Cambridge, we do get complaints. We mostly review complaint investigations by the professional standards unit, but we do occasionally investigate complaints on our own, depending on the circumstances. We also can make policy recommendations, and we review policies, and so we really are a hybrid. That wasn't how it was envisioned, but that's really how it's evolved over the years. So I just talked about that, so I won't read this next slide, but the hybrid models are, again, increasingly common. And now I guess I want to get a little bit into the theory as I get closer to the end here of the formal presentation. I like to always talk about these three pillars of civilian oversight because it's important that it's independent. Now, independent means different things to different people. I define independence as being within the municipal government or county government, whatever the structure is, where the law enforcement agency is. But you are independent of that agency. So you're not within it. The head of the oversight agency and the police chief may report to the mayor, the city manager, council, a public safety director. But ideally, you want to have something where that independence allows them to do what they need to do, but they're also placed within government so that they can be part of the process of ensuring recommendations are followed, making change happen. And the next pillar is transparency. And this is, as we all know, very important in the current time we're in. But I would say it's really a shared responsibility. Again, every state is different with different public records laws and open meeting laws and personnel records laws, but it's important to the extent that you can to be transparent. Share as much as you can, and that also involves union contracts, political situation. You have to tailor it, but be as transparent as you can. Provide as much information as you can, because no matter what you provide, people will have more questions, but the less information that's given to the public, the harder it is to build trust. And so it's something that's not just up to the oversight agency because it involves multiple stakeholders, multiple state departments in a city. And finally, accountability. Everyone needs accountability. And that's also true for the civilian oversight agency. There has to be a way that the oversight agency is reporting out, that the oversight agency is understood, that they're going out and doing outreach, that they're connecting with people, and that people know that they are accountable to the government and through the government to the broader community. So next I want to touch on some of the things that are important for oversight to do. And actually I'm going to read this one. I don't normally read these, but civilian oversight practitioners have a unique role as public servants overseeing law enforcement agencies. The community, government, and law enforcement have entrusted them to conduct their work in a professional, fair, and impartial manner. They earn this trust through a firm commitment to the public good, the mission of their agency, and to holding themselves to ethical and professional standards. And they need to seek professional development to ensure competence, acquire the necessary knowledge and understanding of the policies, procedures, and practices of the law enforcement agency that you conduct oversight of. And again, that's important for everyone engaged in oversight. So in my role as the director of an agency, the staff person who works with me, the members of the board, our Police Review and Advisory Board here in Cambridge, all of them have to be thinking about this. And I'll again parenthetically say, one of the challenges in this work is that generally oversight occurs because there are issues. People have concerns. And it's a really fine, not even a fine line or a balance, but it's a challenge to keep in mind that you are here because of problems. You are here because people are unhappy. People have been hurt. People are bringing complaints. And we don't represent those complainants. We're not their attorney. We're not their advocate. We, depending on the structure, we may be conducting a process or monitoring a process, but we have to be fair and impartial and look at each case based on the facts. It's a little bit like a jury. So it's a complicated thing. And again, this is part of why legitimacy is so important. And I want to harp on that when I do these presentations, because this is one of the key places where oversight can lose legitimacy, is when either the law enforcement agency or the government officials, the elected officials, the appointing authority, community members, somebody feels that this agency is not fair and impartial. And people will also feel that the agency needs to be an advocate for social change. So there are ways to do that while still being fair and impartial. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about a report that will be coming out. So in terms of effectiveness, this is how we get to our effective oversight practices. Under the previous administration, we got a grant from the Department of Justice to do a 2-year study of effective civilian oversight. And we did report based on 9 case studies on some previous research we had done. I should go to that slide. And we're going to be publishing this hopefully soon. Without getting into too much detail, we've been working with the Department of Justice. They do not currently plan to publish the report themselves, but part of the agreement when we got the grant was that we would have the right to publish it ourselves, so it won't just be embargoed. So this will hopefully be out by September. We have 9 case studies. We've got the report on the state of the field and effective oversight practices, and I did share, I don't know if everyone has gotten it, but some of the people who are staffing and on this call do have it. We sent some excerpts from that around the models of oversight, recommendations for effective practices, and that's available to people. But the whole report will be out hopefully soon. And also this decision-making guidebook and an interactive online toolkit. So very quickly, again, you don't need to read this, but these were the case studies we did. It was a range of agencies. You can just glance at this and see cities of different sizes with different populations. And I have no idea how I'm sorry, that was Siri talking to me from my watch. As a range of models, populations, sizes, geography. We really wanted to get a broad look at the field of civilian oversight. And we did this report, and as I said, it'll be coming out soon, but some preliminary observations that are even more true since we finished the drafting of the report. The number of oversight agencies continues to grow. Data-driven policy analysis is more and more common. There's a real variety of access to departmental records and information, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And again, I won't read the whole thing, but accountability and evaluation requirements are becoming more important for civilian oversight. Traditionally, you just did what you did and you put out the findings, but more and more people want to know the methodology, how are you doing it? And as I mentioned as well, there's more of a focus on front-end accountability and not only back-end accountability. And finally, procedural justice and legitimacy with all stakeholders are key for effective oversight. So we did develop, and again, this is one of the things that I mentioned, these 13 principles for effective civilian oversight. I'll show them in a moment. But as you think about this, and again, this is very true for the city of Columbus, looking at these effective practices, they're not all saying every agency needs to do this. You have to look at if each practice fits your context, your legal situation, the community situation, the needs, how the law enforcement agency works in your community. And if you are thinking about the principles of effectiveness, how does a specific thing strengthen oversight in that whole context? And finally, this is very important, what are the potential unintended consequences of implementing a practice? But I'll just give one example. This is not exactly on point, but it'll illustrate my bigger point. Subpoena power. One of the very first questions almost anyone asks me about when we're looking at starting civilian oversight, we have things we want to do. The first thing people say is subpoena power. And I think subpoena power is valuable. My agency has subpoena power. I do recommend it to people. And sometimes, because of legal considerations, because of union contracts, it becomes the sticking point. And I've always said to people, you know, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Don't give up creating an effective oversight agency because you're so focused on the need to have subpoena power. Because the reality is, I think a lot of people think with subpoena power, you can call in officers, force them to testify, tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under the pains and penalties of perjury. But the reality is, like everybody else, police officers have Fifth Amendment rights, and there are also garrity rights from a Supreme Court decision, so that superior officers can compel officers to tell them things, but then there are real limits on what you can do with that information because it's a compelled statement. I'm not an attorney. I'm sure some of you are, but you can see that having subpoena power is not the thing that's going to force the police to come and tell you everything. So that's just one illustration of what are the unintended consequences. So to move on to the famous 13 principles, here they are. Again, I won't go through them all, but these are things that as we did our case studies, as we talked to people, and for each of these case studies, we met with a number of stakeholders in each city, people in elected positions, appointed positions, people in policing. We talked to union people, oversight staff, community members, activists. And these were the 13 principles that came out of all of that work. Some of them I've really already talked about, things like independence, clearly defined and adequate jurisdictional authority as people think about crafting ordinances. Every city has a different style, every state has some different standards, but making sure that you put enough detail in that things are clear and that there's not lots of bickering between the oversight agency and the law enforcement agency about what they can do and what they can't do. And also so that the community is aware of what this agency is going to do and it's not going to do. Very often people will say to me, well, we had civilian oversight, but it's completely failed. Or, it really hasn't worked. And when I talk to people, 9 times out of 10, what I discover is that the oversight agency failed to meet expectations. It did what it was supposed to do. It did what the ordinance empowered it to do, but the expectations of people, for whatever reason, did not match the reality of what the oversight agency was set up and established to do. Some of the other things, again, I won't go through them all, but unfettered access, full cooperation, adequate funding and operational resources, all important. Again, talking about transparency and reporting, doing community outreach, having community involvement and engagement. And then, again, the very last thing, procedural justice and legitimacy. I do think it's really important. And I'm realizing that as I say it like every third slide, but it is a huge part of the work that we do. So expectations of oversight. As this work proceeds, what people find very quickly, if they didn't know at the front end, is that they need to be really familiar with the police practices and investigations and to a certain extent, criminal law and criminal procedure. Now, I'm more talking about staff, but this is also true to a large extent for people that serve on civilian oversight boards, civilian review boards. Impartial and objective, again, same thing. That there needs to be a willingness to meet with and communicate with the police department and their staff. Sometimes, because of the nature of individuals or because of the way an agency was formed, there can be this adversarial relationship. Now, I have a very cooperative relationship here with the police department that I conduct oversight of. We don't always agree on everything, but we respect each other, we listen to each other, and we have a good, strong working relationship so that we can cooperate with each other. We have to keep things confidential. That generally hasn't been a problem, but occasionally there are instances where someone will release information that they have access to that they're not supposed to. And so it's just really important to get people on boards and staff as well, get training in ethics laws, they get training in confidentiality, personally identifiable information, all the things that as government people we all know are vitally important. And the last point, again, just without reading it, but the idea that most of us, because of our life experience, because of our implicit biases, we form opinions, right? A complaint comes in, you read the complaint, you form an opinion. You have to be able to put that to the side. Of course, you think what you think, your biases are your biases, but you have to be able to objectively look at the information as you get it and weigh it. Be aware of the history of our country, of racism, of problems, but also look at each case individually, and vitally important. Another thing that's really important for establishing credibility is training and professional development. For new members of a board or commission, they need to get serious training. NACOL provides lots of training. We have an annual conference. This year we're doing it virtually over the course of a month, but usually we get together in person for about 4.5 days, about 500 people, 30 to 40 sessions, plenaries, specific workshops, training. We have ongoing training during the year. And there are lots of other places that people can get training from as well. People should also get trained by the police department. They should know how the police are training their officers, how they train officers in use of force, how they train officers to conduct stops, what sort of anti-bias training and training on procedural justice a department may be doing. Board members and staff need to know all of these things. Again, developing an effective program of board orientation is really important. I was just sort of talking about that. And it has to be something that is ongoing. I know I've said this, but again, it's very important that people don't sort of get some training, go on a couple of ride-alongs, go to the Citizen Police Academy, maybe do a firearm simulation training so they can kind of see what it's like for officers making those split-second decisions, and then they're on the board for 10 years. Training has to be something that goes on continuously, just like any other profession. Just a couple more slides here. And I'm talking a long time. Sorry about that. The ethical and professional standards. We have a code of ethics. It's on our website. Again, reflective of a lot of the same things, but this is what we demand at NACOL about the people who are oversight practitioners. As a board member of NACOL, I can be kicked off the board if I am not following the code of ethics. Some of it's a little fuzzy, but they all are deeply meaningful. You know, again, I won't read them all. You can read them. They're on the website, but they're really important. Because we have to have credibility with everybody. And if we are not acting in an ethical way, if we come in with an agenda, that will not work. And then just to wrap up, is civilian oversight the answer? No. And that's one of those things about expectations of oversight. In St. Louis, they started civilian oversight, and you might, I don't know if you can read that little thing, but there was a scuffle in a January 2015 Board of Aldermen meeting. The committee was proposing a civilian review board for the city police department, and the police union had people show up in force. So this was the crowd, and they were very unhappy, and they let the council know. And in the end, St. Louis did form civilian oversight, but it was a rocky road. And there's always a lot of distrust. There's a lot of distrust of who are these people to judge police officers. They're not, they have to walk in their shoes. And that's part of why I emphasize all the training and all the work to build credibility. However, even if it's not the answer, civilian oversight is necessary. That those pictures there are from New York City. That picture there is from New York City in the 1960s, where there was a civilian complaint review board. It was basically inside the police department, and it didn't really give people the sense that it was something that was legitimate. So they worked and they fought and they created an agency, which is now the largest civilian oversight agency in the country. They have about 150 staff. Now, again, they're working with the police department with about 40,000 sworn officers, so their task is big. But it took a long time, and it has helped. Things aren't perfect in New York or anyplace else, but they have made a big difference. And then the last thing, as I mentioned, many of you might be interested in this. We have our virtual conference. I have to do a little plug. It's starting on July 20th, and there's going to be a series of webinars. We had planned to meet in Tucson over 4.5 days. Our two-person staff has been amazing and has transformed this into 32 webinars over the space of a couple of months. So there's information on our website. I'm happy to talk more about it or email people or whatever. But anyone who is thinking about being part of the future work on oversight, who wants to know more about it, check out the program. You can register for the whole thing for a combined fee or do individual webinars. So I think people might find it very interesting. So that is my last slide. So I am going to see if I can unshare my screen. And if I haven't bored you all to tears with my lecture, I would be happy to entertain any questions and try to provide any additional information through the chair. Thank you.
Brian, thank you very much for that presentation, and I appreciate your willingness to engage with us tonight about this incredibly important topic. Wanted to give an opportunity to some of the commission members who are here with us. And I know when we spoke last week, we talked a little bit about the work of the commission, and certainly that this was a focus of theirs. But wanted to allow you here tonight, wanted to give that sort of very important presentation about the overview of sort of how these function around the country and some of the not best practices as you mentioned, but effective practices, trying to keep the nomenclature correct. So with that, I wanted to allow some of the commissioners we have with us here tonight to ask any questions they may have of you. Commissioners?
Yes, this is Brooke. So while I understand your report isn't finished yet, are you able to kind of give some, just an overview or some highlights of the effectiveness, and sorry, that's my 3-year-old, the effectiveness of what some boards have seen accomplished?
Well, let's see. No, I appreciate that question. It's fine. I did not come prepared to answer quite in that way. I guess what I would say is, yeah, I think that's why we focus on these effective practices, because the boards vary so much. And I think I'm just trying to think of a couple good examples off the top of my head. So I'd say a couple of small examples. So for example, in Washington, D.C., the Office of Police Complaints, the civilian oversight agency for the District of Columbia, did a report about 3 years ago on body-worn cameras. The department, the Metropolitan Police Department, was looking at body-worn cameras, and many cities have procured them and are using them, but there were a lot of questions in Washington about how the cameras would be used, what would be the policies, what would be the practices, how would people get access to the video if they could get access to it. And so they did a report based on this kind of model of research, of looking at people's work from different communities, and it really had an impact on how the district moved forward. I guess another example would be in New York City. This is going to be a little bit general, but they have an Office of the Inspector General for the NYPD, which is separate from their Civilian Complaint Review Board. And that office has done a number of systemic reviews, but one of the ones they did that was very interesting was a stop and frisk. So as you know, there was a federal investigation. There's a lot going on with that, but they were able to really dig into years of data and look at the patterns and practices around stop and frisk and make some broader recommendations about how to change the whole focus of the sort of numbers-driven policing. Something that started, CompStat as this idea of really being measurable and using data-driven policing, and it really turned into quotas and, a sort of distortion of the original broken windows idea. So it's probably not a very good answer, but I'll stop with that for the moment.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Brian. Other commissioners?
Yeah, could I jump in, Brian? That was a really outstanding presentation. I really thought it was excellent. I do have a question. You mentioned the importance of developing trust and maintaining trust in the community, the importance of independence, and then the importance of also trust from officers. And in some ways, those three are somewhat in tension, right? How you achieve all of those. Do you have, or can you speak to models of appointing these bodies or models of nominating people serving these bodies that seem to get the right balance across those, where you have independence, but you also have a body that the community feels is representative, but also a body that individual officers have confidence in that they'll be treated fairly?
That's a great question. And again, the standard caveat, there are so many different models and so many different ways this happens. So there are some places where, a handful of places like Detroit, where the board is actually elected. They run in the same districts as the city councilors. I mean, Detroit will tell you it's great. As a native Detroiter, I love my home city. I don't know that that's really the best method for choosing people. And interestingly enough, I think about a third to a half of the people on their board are retired police officers who have gotten themselves elected by running on a platform of, I'm a former cop and I know how they work and they can't fool me. One way to do it. There are definitely places where you have an appointing authority like the mayor or the city manager, and that may be general. For example, in Cambridge, our city manager appoints all boards and commissions. So it's not really an option. It's part of the city charter. But you will find a lot of places increasingly where they're trying to figure out a way to have either or some combination of appointees made by different appointing authorities. So perhaps the mayor will appoint some people, the city council may. So New York City just did a charter revision, and in their charter revision, they went from having the mayor appoint everyone to having the mayor appoint a number of people, the city council has some appointees, and they have something called the public advocate in New York City, which is unique to New York. It's kind of like an ombudsperson, but that person actually gets to appoint someone. And one of the concerns was that if the mayor is appointing everybody and the oversight agency is under the mayor and the police chief is under the mayor, how do you really have that balance? One thing you see a lot in California, which is more a California thing, is each council member gets to appoint someone to each board or commission. You know, there are upsides and downsides, and I recognize I'm speaking to members of the city council. I think one of the challenges is that doesn't necessarily bring together a coherent group. So having said that, there are a lot of different ways you can do it. I think, the last thing I'll mention is that, for example, when Newark created the Civilian Oversight Board a few years ago, what they did is they actually had dedicated seats for different community organizations, for a Latino organization in Newark, for the NAACP. Again, I'm not here to sort of recommend that this city is doing it perfectly, that one's not. It's an interesting model. I think you run into questions of, well, why did you pick this group and not that group, especially if it's written into the ordinance. So it's not a specific answer, but I guess what I would say is thinking about Columbus, thinking about your politics, thinking about the nature of your community and who are the different constituencies and who feels heard and who doesn't feel heard. How can you create a model where people do represent different backgrounds, different sectors, and that the appointing authorities, whoever they may be, are really asked to look at creating a balance. So you have some people with law enforcement background of some type. They don't have to be police officers, but they understand that way of thinking. So you have people who may come from an academic background. You have people who are community activists. But ultimately, they all have to be able to commit to truly being impartial. It can't be, now I'm going to get on this board and now we're going to see some real action. We're going to take out some police officers, or now we're going to make sure that the citizens realize that the police have an impossible job and these complaints are all frivolous. You don't want any of that. You want a balanced group of people with different life experience, different perspectives, and again, in whatever way works for your community, can give people that belief that this is a relatively representative group. I mean, again, in my city, we have 5 members, so it's kind of hard for 5 members to truly look representative to people, but we do the best we can. So I'll stop with that.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Brian. Thank you for that, Commissioner.
Quickly, I just want to say thank you, Brian. Your presentation was excellent. There's a lot for us to consider. I mean, just a lot. I mean, we could go on forever. So, but also I want you to please hug your mother for us in Columbus, because that history, and for her to have kept that article. I grew up in the neighborhood next to Ohio State in the 60s.
Okay.
And so that just means so much to me for you to share that as you started your presentation. So thank you. I can't wait to get, this presentation and to really begin to dig into it. So I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
I have
Thank
a question. Great presentation, Brian. It really was excellent. When you had a slide that shows several different cities that were included in the case study that you all did for the grant, it was the 2-year review. I noticed that there were about 3 of them that did the investigative format. About 3 of them did, I think it was the audit monitor format, and then there was a couple of others that did the review. Did the findings or the report that you're going to provide or publish in September give a little bit of details into what were some of the factors that made each city decide to choose that particular format that they chose? And then if so, did it also go into some of the strengths and weaknesses or challenges of those different formats?
So that's a great question, and I have to be honest. It's been about a year and a half since I read the case studies. This report has gone on for so long. So we started the process before I became president of NACOL. I was president for 3 years, and I'm now in my first year as past president. So when I think about the case study for Cambridge, I know that in the interviews, we certainly talked about that. There was some talk about the history. A couple of the people that were interviewed were actually part of the original group of people in the community that were advocating for or were on the initial oversight board back in the 1980s. And then, I don't know, and ours was one of the shorter ones. So, and I honestly don't know for sure, but I think it does touch on those things in each case study. I have to go back and read that report clearly since I'm talking about it. So, we can certainly get you more information on that, and the report will hopefully be out soon.
Okay.
So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Any other commissioners?
I have one, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you again. As everyone else has said, it was just truly an excellent presentation. And I hope the new 16-member panel that's been appointed will also have access to your presentation, because I think it's truly excellent. I've lived in Columbus for 20 years, but I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And that's a city that's been trying to get a civilian oversight up and running and has stalled and sputtered a bit. And I wondered if you're familiar at all with what's been happening in Tulsa, and if you have any guidance to offer us to prevent us from getting in a similar situation.
No, I do. And actually I had some slides about Newark that would kind of address it. Since I talked for 40 minutes, I clearly had too much to say as it was. But so let me say a little bit about Tulsa. I haven't worked directly with them very much, but I have sat down and talked with Tiffany Crutcher, whose brother Terrence Crutcher was killed, and they've been
a classmate of mine.
Oh wow! Okay, so she's come to our conferences. The last 3, they've been working very hard, and I mean I have to say this is my opinion. I know that they've been pushing for and this has happened a lot recently, pushing for a really strong oversight model. There's this idea that we need to be strong like the police, and we need to really have control over the police. And the city was kind of going toward a model that didn't have quite as much authority. And the activists, the last I heard, that they were very upset and they were pushing back, saying, "Don't pass this." And I think my general advice to people, and it's not true in every situation, is get something in place and then follow all the things I said, because you don't want to establish something and set up for failure. But then you can work to change it, and I would say most communities, if oversight gets established, they need to go back 3, 5, 10 years later and look at it. How is it working? How is it fitting within the community environment? How has the community changed? How has the police department changed? I'd say it's better to get something that's pretty good and then work to make it better. And without going on too long, I'd say in Newark very specifically worked, their goal was to create the strongest ordinance in the country. And I used to work at the ACLU of Massachusetts before I came to the city. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but I was an organizer at the ACLU. So some of my former colleagues were working on this, and they were pushing really hard to have lots of power, to have this very diverse board appointed in different ways. And the mayor was a big advocate, Mayor Ross Baraka, who came in after Cory Booker, and really got elected as kind of a radical who was going to change the city of Newark. Long story short, the ordinance got passed. The State Federation of Police filed suit. They got an injunction, and it went through the courts. Well, the injunction basically stopped them from doing almost anything. And their ordinance gave them the power to receive complaints, investigate complaints, do systemic reviews, make policy recommendations. It required the chief to reply back to them if the chief did not agree with their findings, which is a good practice. Actually, it's a good practice not because it's holding people accountable, because it's creating more dialogue and transparency, and all these other things. And then basically they got stalled out. And so now, 4 years later, They are at the point of hiring staff. There's still an appeal, but they got most of their powers confirmed by the court. But for the community members, they were very excited because they've been talking about civilian oversight since the 60s. They got this through. The mayor was a big advocate for it. This lawsuit happened, and now people feel like nothing's happened, and it's just failed. And unfortunately, it's going to be a very hard task for the director, as she hires new people, to really get this oversight agency working and to build trust with the community. NACOL's going to be there to help her however we can, the director there, but it's it's unfortunate. So I don't know the exact situation in Columbus, certainly, but I would say you need to strike a balance between trying to do something that's amazing and the best ordinance ever, and something that can work in your political environment, something that you can get passed, that you can get implemented, that is not going to get taken apart once the individuals in the current positions change. You want something that will be sustainable, and sustainability is really the goal, I would say. So hopefully that's an answer.
Thank you, Brian. We have time for one more question from commissioners before I turn it over to council members. Any other last questions from the commissioners?
Real quick, how much have you looked at Cincinnati went through a process where they went into dissent decree, but they did establish a citizens review board. I worked closely with Iris Rowley, who kind of led some of that work, as well as former Deputy Chief Jeff Blackwell. Do you know anything? I know they've stalled. I know they were last time I spoke to them, at an audit and review because they need to shift some of the things that have happened. So how much do you, or if anything, do you know about what has happened with this process in Cincinnati?
No, unfortunately, I don't know much about it. I mean, I know some of the history and how they got there, but the person who I'd known as director, she just left not that long ago to go to a brand new agency in Fort Worth, Texas. So I heard from someone I know who actually works in Toledo and used to work in Dayton, but apparently is helping with the search. They're searching for a new director. So I unfortunately don't know much about the specifics. And I guess I know a little bit more about Cleveland, not that Cleveland's in the same situation, but Cleveland has had some serious challenges, federal investigation, and they have a civilian oversight agency that seems to be holding its own. It seems to have some level of community support. We did a regional meeting for NACOL in Cleveland about a year and a half ago. It was a one-day meeting, and we heard from a lot of people in the community, as well as law enforcement officers, that there are still challenges, but they feel that overall, people felt that the Civilian Oversight Agency is helping to repair some of the damage. And I mean, the people who came to that meeting included Tamir Rice's mother. I mean, so it was a diverse group of people. But yeah, unfortunately, I know people who can tell you more about what's happening in Cincinnati, but I don't personally have a lot of knowledge about it.
Thank you.
Thank you,
You're
commissioners.
welcome.
Would like to turn it over to council members. President Pro Tem Brown, do you have any questions?
I do. First of all, those were really good questions by our Safety Commission members, and answered so many of mine. So I appreciate again their involvement and dedication. Mr. Kaur, thank you for your time today and providing such excellent information to us. I feel like I still have a lot to do to digest everything that you shared. And I mean that in the highest form of compliment. But I have just kind of one thing to follow on to a question that a commissioner asked, and then kind of one additional question. So as you said, when you were speaking about other cities that have tried and failed to get them going, that sustainability is key, and that it's better to pass something to get started. I worry as a policymaker, because I've seen it happen a lot, that the status quo is very sticky. And I would just say, in the process of getting something done that's politically feasible, your 13 principles are critically important, but knowing that you can't get all 13 right and that the status quo is sticky, are there key pieces that just you may as well not have a civilian review board if you don't have these pieces? I mean, is it the scope being proper, right? To include policy and practice analysis? Is it powers, independent powers? Is it representative members? I don't know that you can totally answer this, but I do think that we have to balance getting as much as we can done, because or maybe embedding something in it that, okay, here's what we're passing, but it is up for review in 3 to 5 years' time. I don't know if other cities have done that, but that strikes me as somewhat important.
Yeah. So, and please, so thank you for those questions, and please remind me if I forget to answer all of them. So starting with the last piece, that's definitely something that we have seen increasingly, is that cities are putting into these ordinances that there will be a review 2 years, 3 years out to look at the functioning and if the model is working and if there are changes that need to be made. So that's definitely something that you could consider. And off the top of my head, I'm not remembering any particular city, but that's the kind of thing I can easily talk to people and find out, because I have people who know more than me about all the details of all the cities. I'm good at the big picture and my own community and a handful of other places I've worked very closely with. I do think that I've got my little cheat sheet over here. So I'm looking over here. I guess I'd say, unfettered access is really important. It's very hard to be effective if you have a mission and you don't have access to the information. Now, if your mission is to review completed investigations and complaints, that's not as hard. But if you're doing investigations, if you're doing policy or analysis, you really need to have a real access. And ideally, access should be full and unfettered. Adequate funding. One of the things that we've seen more recently is cities pegging the budget of the oversight agency to the police budget. Now, in a time where we're talking about defunding the police and reducing police budgets, I know some of my colleagues are a little nervous about that, but until this moment, the idea that, your budget would be, say, 1% of the police department's budget. In New York City, when they revised their charter, they put in a figure of 0.65%. But that actually was a big budget boost. And part of the reason that's important is because as the responsibilities of the police department change, the responsibilities of the oversight agency may change. So in New York, when they adopted body-worn cameras, all of a sudden, the dozens of investigators at the Civilian Review Board or the Civilian Complaint Review Board were having to look at video. And sometimes 5, 10, 15, 20 hours of video, because there might be an incident that lasts 45 minutes, and if you have 6 officers on the scene, you may have hours of video. And there are incidents that last much longer, have many more officers. So they found that they didn't have the resources to review all the materials that they all of a sudden were getting, because the police department now has body-worn cameras. So that's really, really important. And I guess I would say, I do think public reporting and transparency. Now, again, there are limitations based on state laws, but to the extent that there can be annual reports and other periodic reports that it can say what the complaints were, some kind of summary. I don't know Ohio state law about revealing names of officers. That really varies a lot. I know up here in the Northeast, it's generally you can't reveal the names of officers, but that really varies quite a bit. So. And then I guess it's time to acknowledge what you're saying about things being sticky and the status quo. I totally get that. And so I don't want it to sound like I'm saying, well, get like a police chief advisory council and the chief will just kind of bounce ideas off of them. And, that's better than not having that. That's a good thing to do, but I wouldn't call that really true civilian oversight. Now, on the other hand, I wouldn't say, you should come up with these 15 things and we have to have access to all internal investigations and we have to have complete access to the personnel files and we have to publish everything on the website. That might be more than you want to put into an ordinance. But, and again, there's, dozens of ordinances that you can look at and see what other people have done. And we can certainly help you in terms of just looking at different provisions and what's worked in other places, what might be challenges, that sort of thing. So.
I appreciate that, and I completely understood where you were coming from, and almost reminding myself that the status was sticky is really the most important part of that. Final, very straightforward question, I hope, is that you described a very intensive process of continuous training and continuous professional development for members of these boards. Do you know of any cities that like pay some kind of stipend or something for commission members? I worry a little bit about whenever we appoint commissions, we ask people to volunteer their time. And so we are going to pull naturally from a privileged group of people who have time to give. And I'm just wondering if that's ever done.
It is, and again, off the top of my head, I'm not remembering any specific cities, but I know there are a number of cities where commission members are given stipends. Sometimes it's, for the amount of time they're spending. It's not exactly getting paid hourly, but it depends again on the model. So in some models, you've got 200 cases a year, and the board members are reading all of those cases. In other models, they're reading summaries prepared by the staff. They're not reading through the whole case file. So it sort of varies. For example, I think one of the things that can help is a lot of cities, not all, but a lot of cities do pay for people to attend training. So they'll pay for people to go to the NACOL conference, or if we have a regional meeting, they'll pay for them to do that. We also do webinars and things. So we do that kind of training. There's other training that people can get. There are other people in our field who are oversight practitioners who do specific training on investigations or outreach or communications. It can be a big commitment. I don't want to play that piece down, because depending again on the model you create, it can involve people spending 30 hours a month reading cases, attending meetings, and then going to training on top of it. So that's part of thinking about how is this actually going to work operationally, and what kind of staff do you have? What's the role of the staff versus the role of the board members? Again, there's 160 different ways to do that. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Again, I appreciate it very much. And Councilmember Dorans, those are all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, President Pro Tem. Councilmember Brown.
Brian, thank you for the presentation.
You're welcome.
I have a keen appreciation for all the things you said, because I'm the one that started the program for civilian review in Cleveland in the mid-'80s.
Oh, okay.
Just ask and they will tell you where it started. Part of the concern, though, I'd like to ask you, is the metrics for evaluating the satisfaction on the part of law enforcement, as well as evaluating the satisfaction on the part of the community with regards to civilian review.
Yeah, no, that's an important point. I feel like I'm doing this impressionistic thing, but I know that there are some a lot of places do look at the satisfaction of complainants. Police agencies do that as well. And it can be surveys, it can be talking to people afterward, closeout meetings. There are a lot of different ways to gauge that. And I think it doesn't actually get quite enough attention in oversight. So often people are so busy dealing with complaints and just dealing with some politics often, that they're not doing as much work on kind of connecting back with people and analyzing how people feel about their interactions. In terms of with the law enforcement agency, now that's more interesting. And I know I've heard a couple of people talk about that. I'm not remembering where, but I do think it's an important thing. And that can be, I'd say, where I work, because it's a relatively small shop and we don't get that many complaints numerically, it's a little more informal, and I'm able to talk directly to officers. I'm also able to talk to supervisors and command staff and get a sense. And, nobody ever really likes internal affairs, and they tend to like civilian oversight less. I know here it's a little anecdotal, but we have a reasonably good level of trust with the police officers. partially because they feel that they're treated with procedural justice. And but I do think that, I mean, it's interesting because I'm going to jot this one down, because I think looking at more systemic ways of finding out how officers are feeling and reacting to civilian oversight, because what we tend to hear is we hear from the union as the voice of the rank and file, and that's an important voice. It needs to be heard, but it's not the only voice. So long-winded way of saying that's a really good question, and you're making me think, and I'm gonna do some work and try to find out some more, both to get that answer, but also just for my own knowledge.
And one more question before I turn it over. The cost, the approximate cost, again, for a civilian review, you have to have permanent staff. You need to have other individuals, which varies. What kind of budgets have you heard people offer up with regards to civilian review?
Oh boy, this is another one that is kind of all over the map, and it's funny because the city of Boston, one of the counselors has just put forward an ordinance, and so I was just doing a little work on that. But I would say, I mean, what I kind of came up with looking at that was, I think going back to this principle of some percentage, I'd say, so for your average community, looking at somewhere between, you know, 0.5%, which doesn't sound that big, and 2% of the police department budget for an investigative agency. If you're doing investigations, you're going to need to look at something in that range. So I don't know what the Division of Police's budget is in Columbus. I should have looked that up ahead of time, but I mean, that will probably give you a general ballpark. But yeah, because you will, if you're doing an investigative model, you will need investigators. You're going to need the management of that, depending on how big the agency is. Now, from the complaint numbers I heard from your police chief, you know, I would imagine you'll get more if you have an independent oversight agency. I don't know that it's going to double or triple. It might. It depends on a lot of different things. So if you're talking about 500 to 1,000 complaints a year, you'll need a few staff people. You'll need multiple investigators. You'll probably need an investigative supervisor. You'll need one or two people to do community outreach and engagement. You might even need a communications person. So and that's the kind of information that as you get closer to looking at the model, take that kind of ballpark estimate about how much it will cost and the model, and then it's a little easier to kind of compare to other communities that have similar staffing. There's a lot of budget you can look through and see the staffing. I mean, for example, when I was communicating with the city council in Boston, I sent them a budget document from the Office of Police Complaints in DC. And it was about an 8-page document that went through with both, you know, staffing levels, the funding, and also some of the benchmarks that they use in their budget system in the District of Columbia. So I'd say I don't have a great answer for you now, but when you get closer, we can help you with that, and you've got that ballpark. So hopefully that's somewhat helpful.
Brian, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'll turn it back over to Rob so he can get some of the other colleagues to ask some questions.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Favor.
Good evening, Brian. Thank you for your time and have truly appreciated the information that you have provided this evening. So my question is just a half step off from Councilmember Brown's comment he just made to really underscore this the notion of legitimacy and civilian oversight. And, you know, given the civil unrest that Columbus has experienced and continues to experience to some degree, we're going to have to do some work to reestablish legitimacy with residents, right? And then to create legitimacy with our officers in order for all of this to actually be effective. And so I guess I'm looking for some tangible ways that we can begin that work. I mean, in the past, our former police chief has held large forums to kind of discuss things when we've had excessive use of force as we do the work of
what you're looking at in terms of challenges in the history. But having said that, I would say to the extent that, the last thing is, and the commissioners who are on the phone, I don't actually know the details. That's on me. I didn't take the time to look up the mandate of the commission and all that, but I have a general sense of what's doing. So I'd say it sounds like there's some basis for using the work that's already been happening and the people who've already been appointed to do that. I do think that going out to the community and doing some listening sessions could be a good way to do that. And specifically, what should I say? Again, you don't want to create false expectations. But you do want to give people some information about where things are heading, potentially, what the council is looking at, and asking people what would be important qualities, what would help you as a Columbus resident feel the police have your back. What would you feel? What would make you feel like you could go make a complaint and it would be meaningful? What would allow, sort of asking the community. And, I work in local government. We all know that community forums can be, sometimes you hear the same voices over and over. And so I'd say then figuring out, and this is one of our challenges in my own city, how to hear from the people who aren't the people who, when you say, we're having a meeting from 6 to 8 and you can come and stand up and speak at the mic, how do you reach those other people? Is it through community organizations? Is it going to senior housing and talking to people in the lobby? Is it putting out surveys about not just people's experience, but I think, and part of it is, my advice would be to be forward-looking, because as important as it is to hear people's stories and to hear what people have been through, it's also important to hear what people want out of their police department. And then what do they want out of an oversight agency? Because I think, unfortunately, the typical answer is, well, we want accountability. We want people to be held accountable when there's misconduct. We want bad apples fired, and we want it now. And that's great, but that isn't really a roadmap for creating something that's sustainable in your community. So I sort of digging a little bit deeper and asking questions that can elicit more of a narrative. Really getting people to tell their stories, not only of what they've seen or experienced that's negative, but what has worked. Hopefully something has worked for many people, whether it's what's worked with the police department, what's worked with government agencies, what's worked with community groups. So I don't know, it's a little bit of brainstorming on my end, but I think that you want to engage people in the conversation and be clear kind of where you're going, so people don't get a false expectation. But truly listening to people.
Yeah, and I've been very clear in just my remarks as we've been navigating this process of reimagining public safety, that it truly has to be a collaborative effort between not just us as council members, but community members and officers. We need everyone at the table in order to reimagine what safety looks like. So just one more question. You mentioned this idea of lawful but awful, and the back end accountability. Earlier this evening, Chief Quinlan kind of talked about an idea of mediating between officers and residents when complaints through IAB may not move forward. Do you see that as a good form of kind of curing that lawful but awful scenario that's inevitable to happen as we go through this process, or once the review board gets going?
It certainly can be. I guess when I think about lawful but awful, it's a broad category, and it can be. It's often more things where the police follow the procedures, but people are unhappy. And that can be one type of thing that you would do a mediation for. So at least mediation is a whole field as well, and within oversight. And I realized it didn't even come up in my presentation. I'll have to remedy that in the future. So we have a part of our rules in Cambridge. We have mediation. I was talking about the CCRB in New York City. They have a whole mediation unit with, I think, about 10 staff that do mediation. There are lots of different ways to handle it, but generally with a mediation, if the case seems potentially ripe for mediation, that this is the kind of thing where it would actually hopefully benefit both the complainant and the officer to sit down and hear from each other and hopefully come to more of a shared understanding of the incident and also very much generally for the officer to really be able to hear what the person's experience was. Because most officers, in my experience, don't think they think they did everything right. So what's your problem? And to be able to actually hear from a person, a real person, how something impacted them can be very powerful. It doesn't always work. And a lot of times people aren't interested in mediation. Unions often don't like it. And especially because, say, in my model where I work, if the mediation fails, the complaint process goes back to the investigation. There are models, which I don't recommend, where once you sign up for mediation, the complaints are torn up. I don't think that's a good model. I mean, that's not how mediation works in the rest of the world. Mediation. Oh, yes, and the other thing about mediation is that I think if it starts to work, the word spreads. Because within police departments, a lot of things are, my buddy told me about this. So if my buddy told me that, I went before the Civilian Complaint Review Board and this guy was a jerk, this investigator didn't know anything about policing, that gets spread. If it is, I went there and we did this mediation and, it actually was a good experience because I got to tell my side of the story, but, I didn't realize how my actions impacted this person. And I actually learned something from it. I think it's a good thing to do. That will spread in the department as well. And, everything in between or different. So I do think that the principle of mediation is important because it's the idea of trying to make it right. Accountability is absolutely necessary. I am not anti-accountability, but I think because I hear so much about accountability, I try to kind of push it's more than accountability. It's about restoration. If you think about a restorative justice model, how do we deal with the harm that's been caused and how do we restore the relationship? In a city of, 1 million people with thousands of officers, and it's a little different, but that same principle can apply because that relationship is not just between that officer and that individual. It's between all of the officers in the community, and it involves all the people that wore that uniform before going back as far as that agency and back into U.S. history. So it's a complicated set of things, but I do think that the idea of mediation, when it works, is really, really powerful. And it's a lot better than a complaint process where you file a complaint and at the end of the complaint, your allegations were sustained and the officer, if you could, like here in Massachusetts, we can't even say, and X will happen to the officer. Many states, they can. But that may help someone feel a little bit better. But if they can actually have a conversation and be heard and have an officer acknowledge how something made them feel. And I focus a lot on the complainant, but I will say that I've definitely seen mediations where the complainant in the end realized, okay, well, so you were supposed to do that and I see why you did that. Now I understand. I didn't realize what you were dealing with. That's not the standard narrative right now in the conversations about policing, and it's certainly not the biggest problem. But again, that's a very positive experience when an officer can have someone who came in angry, thinking that they were mistreated, walk out, maybe not saying, oh, I think you did everything just fine and you're great, but now I understand why you did that. I understand why you didn't speak to me or why you spoke to me that way, or, and I think it helps officers to have to articulate to someone who's not their superior why they did what they did. So anyway, it's a very long answer, so I apologize.
No, I appreciate that answer actually, and it circles back around to once again enforcing legitimacy in the entire process when you have open dialogue. So thank you for your responses, Councilmember Dorrance. That's all my questions.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Remy.
Thanks again, Councilmember Dorrance. Brian, thank you so much for the presentation. As a fellow Detroiter and somebody that spent a number of years up there, my other hometown, I certainly appreciate the work that you do within this space. I have just some basic questions for people that are listening. In a city our size, with the type of cases that you heard the chief mention, historically, how often do these commissions or civilian review boards typically meet, given those parameters? And I'm sure it's all over the board. Who do they, at least some of the better ones that you could think of, who do they report back to? Is it the council? Is it a mayor? Is it the chief? Is it, and do they make those reports public every XYZ if they're meeting quarterly, monthly, et cetera? And then, at the end of the day, how do we evaluate these civilian review boards on their effectiveness?
Okay, so let me try to take a stab at that. And I guess first question: East Side or West Side?
Actually, I lived in a suburb, but I was a pharmaceutical rep in the city of Detroit, so I know just about every street there is.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll do the Detroit flashback later. We won't. I won't bother other people, but I am curious. So, in terms of meeting, it varies a ton. It really depends on how much work they have to do. My board meets monthly. Like a lot of boards in Cambridge, we often don't meet in July and August, but this year we are, because we didn't meet during the pandemic. Well, we're still in the pandemic, but because of the pandemic, we didn't meet for about 3 months, so we have some catching up to do. I know the board in Detroit meets every week. I don't actually know why they meet every week. I know that they meet every single week, which is a lot, but they're elected officials, so it's a little different. It does vary quite a bit how much they meet, but my general understanding is that most boards meet once a month. Some do meet twice a month, and sometimes boards have to have special meetings to review additional cases. So, I mean, it's sort of like a typical board or commission in most places. Now, I know you asked me more, and I didn't start writing down until the end. So, you had asked about how often people meet.
Who they report back up to.
Oh, thank you. So in most cases, it's the mayor or the city manager, depending on the municipal structure. Again, there are some places where that person will report to the public safety director. That's pretty unusual. And I'll be honest, I recognize the public safety director for your say may be on the line still, but the challenge is that the public safety director in most places is often skewed a bit more toward policing. So it can be challenging. And a lot of times public safety directors are drawn from the ranks of former police chiefs, either locally or someplace else. So it's not always the best arrangement. There are also models where the commission kind of reports to itself. Again, I don't necessarily recommend these models, but in Los Angeles, you have a police commission that's appointed by the mayor, but the police commission actually hires and supervises the police chief and the inspector general for the police department. So all the police oversight and the police department are all under the police commission in the city of Los Angeles. But again, they're mayoral appointees. So they're under the mayor, but it's a couple steps removed. It's a little bit all over the map in terms of the possibilities. So, as you're looking at it, I think there are places where people are starting to look at trying to have it report to the council. I guess it really just has to do with kind of how you structure your municipal government and how many different people are elected, who do they report to. I think the last thing I'll say is I think about Portland, Oregon. Portland is perhaps the last major city in the country that functions under a commission form of government. So what is their city council is their commission, and there are 5 commission members, and each commissioner has executive responsibilities. So the city departments are divided up among the 5 commissioners, and there's usually one who's in charge of public safety. But the civilian oversight agency reports separately. The head of the civilian oversight agency reports to the city auditor, who is also elected. So in Portland, you have a city auditor who is elected and hires the head of the oversight agency. And then I believe the members of the board are appointed by the commissioners. I don't remember, I think they're appointed by the commissioners as a whole, but it's really the oversight director who has most of the responsibility, and they again work for the city auditor. So generally, mayor, city manager, but there's all sorts of possibilities.
Thank you very much, Brian. We'll catch up on the other side of this about Detroit.
All right, look forward to it.
Councilmember Dorrance.
Thank you, Councilmember Ramey, and I will not forget Council President Harden this time. So, Council President Harden, do you have any questions for our guests?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There have been so many great questions. I will just refine my question to one. It's more of process of how do we get there. Do you have any perspective on independent investigatory body and charter review being set up based off of an ordinance versus, say, taking it to the ballot and then the people engage? Do you have any feedback or guidance?
That's a really great question. That's a good final question. If indeed it's a final question, it doesn't have to be. But no, I really mean that. It's a great wrap-up question. Yeah, I'd say there's a trend. It's not a majority, but there are more and more places that are looking at putting it into the charter. I've seen cities that had oversight, which was done by executive order or done by an ordinance, then moved to put it into the charter. I'm here in Massachusetts. So again, I grew up in Detroit where charter reviews were normal. I live in Massachusetts where there's basically no such thing. It's all pretty much done through the legislature. And so we don't do charter reviews. We don't have charter commissions. But, where they do, I've seen it be a really good way to help people understand more about the oversight agency, raise awareness, and there's a campaign attached to it. So if there are people in the community that are supportive of it, community activists can get involved. Now, the downside is that then it becomes more political, and especially if there's resistance or opposition from elements of law enforcement or unions, it can become a bit of a divisive thing. But I guess the other thing I'd say it's really good about having it in the charter is it's in the charter, all right, for all the reasons that we have city charters. If that's part of the fundamental structure of the municipal government, it's there until someone takes it out. And I would say that's also a place, if you put it in the charter, you want to have some kind of provision about pegging the budget or having some specifics about adequate budget, because I kind of glossed over this. But one of the things that we've seen over many, many years is that civilian oversight gets established, and then whoever develops the budget, usually the mayor or the city manager, just doesn't really give it much or any funding, and it's not able to function. So having it in the charter can be very helpful in that way as well, if there's a way to ensure that it has adequate staffing and funding. So I'll stop with that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Council President Harden. Thank you, Brian, for the presentation. I am going to leave that as the last question, not only because I believe it sets that excellent tone for what council's path forward may or may not be here, but also it's helpful to go last because all the questions I have were answered brilliantly by you throughout the process. I don't think we've left any stone unturned. So, Brian, I really appreciate you being so generous with your time this evening and really walking not only council, but I think the community through how these things have been structured across the country, and frankly, how to structure them in a way to make sure that they're effective not only for the community. I think that transparency and trust aspect you've talked about is really key, but for law enforcement as well, to make sure that these things actually function in the way that we want them to. So I really appreciate you doing that deep dive, not only with council, the commission, and also the community tonight. So I really appreciate you being here.
Well, you're very welcome. It's really been a privilege. And as I said, when I kind of go back to the beginning, when it struck me at about 2 o'clock that, I think I have these pictures from the clips of my mom's arrest. It just feels like it's the right place for me to be today. So I'm very glad to be able to spend the time with you. I'm glad it's been helpful. And I and NACOL will remain a resource. So as you go through the process, I'm sure you'll be reaching out. We'll get you that report once it's done. And really, don't hesitate to contact us with questions about ordinances, structure, staffing, practices. Who else can we talk to? Who else might have faced certain challenges? We're here to help. And if it's okay, I'm going to stay on for a little bit and listen to public comment because I'm like a government geek and I love to find out how things work in other communities. And it really helps me as I do my work to hear people's concerns. So I'm going to mute myself and stick around. But again, thank you so much, Mr. Chair, for having me here. And thank you to all of the council members and commissioners for your time and attention. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you. It's difficult to speak for 7 independently elected officials, but I think that I can do so in saying I think we're definitely going to view you and Nicole as certainly a resource as we sort of figure this out for the community. So you'll be hearing from us. So thank you. I would like to move on to the public testimony portion of the evening. We have 4 individuals that submitted speaker slips to my office today before the deadline. We also had a number of individuals that submitted written testimony, which I will make sure shared with all the council offices. We will allow, I think Angie is with us. She will unmute you. And if you are with us, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I would ask you to let us know. I'll read your name off, but let me know if I've mispronounced it in any way. I apologize if I do, but let us know who you are, if you represent any organization, and would ask you to keep your comments to 3 minutes. So with that, Miss Angie, do we have Melissa Lipinski?
Yeah. Yeah.
Melissa, we hear you. Feel free to go ahead and get started.
Oh. Thank you. I just want to start by saying that I definitely echo Ms. Alzada's concerns. It seems like the chief isn't well on board as far as what the agenda is. The body makes the laws regardless of intention and the letter of the law. So what's important is like the nature of its enforcement. And with that said, CPD abuses their power to enforce it on a daily basis. They're not only abusing like the Constitution, they are also abusing universal doctrine of human rights, the 30 articles passed in 1949 that the United States got on with. And essentially, I've witnessed CPD target people of color in and out of the protest. That violates Article 7. I've seen them make petty arrests instead of a simple ticket, which, violates number 9. And I guess, I don't want to waste too much of your time. I simply wanted to, I guess the real question I had is like, it seems like the FOP seems to be the issue. And I'm not sure how we got here. Like how is it the FOP has so much power within the legislation, especially when it comes to like, police defunding and, rebuilding of the trust. And so I feel like we as a community, and you guys included, I just hope that there could be some like resolutions, things that such as things such as the body cam laws due to Bill 217 from Colorado, or perhaps a review board based off of Phoenix, or I know it doesn't happen overnight like in Massachusetts, but I was just hoping that perhaps we could just gather from all of these and make one review board, essentially, if that was possible.
Thank you, Ms. Lipinski, for your comments tonight. I think that one of our goals is to make sure that interacting with folks like Brian is that we're trying to find. I know he'll never say best practices, but sort of effective tools from across the country that, as we go down this path, that is going to be needed for the body that we ultimately enact here in Columbus to make sure that we do things right, because I think we want to learn from the successes from other parts of the country, but also their failures. And I appreciate you talking about that holistic approach that I think we want to take here in Columbus. So appreciate you being here. Next, we have Mr. Michael Linscott Hill. Mr. Linscott Hill, are you with us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can. Go ahead. Let us know if you are a representative from any organization, and you have 3 minutes.
Yeah, so my name is Michael Scott Hill. I don't represent an organization. I'm a resident of Galloway. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak here. I mean, first and foremost, history is starting to repeat itself as we go back to Mr. Core's article from the newspaper. It's all continuing. I was born and raised in Ohio, and I've been a resident of Columbus for 10 years. I have grown with the city and believe that Columbus had something different to offer me than other cities I have lived in across this country. Over the last 45 days, I've become disgusted with the leadership on all levels and their lack of action to their constituents. We have heard nothing but censored information from all levels of government, and no one has come to the people that are protesting to understand why we are still here. This is bigger than Black Lives Matter and goes to the very root of our democracy. If I am not able to speak with our mayor to discuss the social issues of the city, then why do we even have a mayor? Our city police has been taking orders from our city attorney's office at the direction of Mayor Ginther, and there has been no progress made except for targeting protesters, which has been confirmed through police scanners. As public servants, you are required to be level-headed and open to view differences and opinions. This is not what is happening in the streets. The police and public and government leaders are slinging propaganda and misrepresenting what is really going on in the streets, causing misinformation to the general public. People are being falsely arrested and detained in police vehicles, specifically number 9100, for hours, being paraded around downtown as if this is a show of force to intimidate the protesters. Police officers are lunging at protesters unlawfully and antagonizing them to get a rise so they can make more arrests. This goes back to the police are there to keep the peace and not to cause chaos. If they are not able to handle rude comments from the public, they should not be working the streets. In my profession, if I conducted myself with these actions, I would be immediately fired because Ohio is an at-will state. The mayor is saying the people need to stand up to the FOP, but that is why we, quote unquote, elected him to office. We are about to change history, and city leaders and members of this board are not without controversy. And until this information is made publicly by you and you are being held accountable for your own actions, we will continue to come in the masses and start publicly naming you. We are coming at complicit politicians and heed this warning that you need to get right with the community or you will be named. I am disgusted with everything that the city is doing and tired of seeing Columbus on the national and world news. The whole world is watching how the United States is handling this situation, and I am ashamed to say that you represent me and my community. I challenge you to challenge the mayor to, number one, stand up to the FOP and remove qualified immunity. Demilitarize, not defund the police, and reallocate the funds to hire licensed social workers to handle nonviolent calls. And since 2017, there have been more than 3,500 citizen complaints to CPD-IAB. Give actual members of the community the opportunity to be on this board of review. And with no disrespect, the board of review that Mayor Ginther has proposed is just a gangbang group. It has nothing to represent who this community is, and you are looking at nothing but publicly elected officials appointing high people in high places that are not.
Can you wrap it up for us? We've already went past the 3 minutes.
We are asking that you expunge all nonviolent protest-related charges for police conspiracies to false arrests, hold all public leaders accountable, and don't just wait to see if the public finds out. Finally, stop dodging us and take action. Your seats depend on it. The new American Revolution has begun. I am just a pissed off gay white male of the resident of Columbus, and don't forget, I just got the civil protection to not be fired from my job for being gay.
Thank you, Mr. Lidsky-Hill, for joining us tonight and providing us with your perspective. Next, we have Ms. Kim Travenor. Ms. Travenor, are you with us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can. You have 3 minutes, and let us know if you're here representing any organization.
Thank you. I am not with an organization, but due to my academic background in human behavior, I know that with any misconduct claims, there are two sides. But who is in the position of power versus vulnerability can't be ignored in this issue. When power dynamics are abused, the sides can't be seen as objectively equal. As in sexual assault, this is an example of equity as a fair and impartial viewpoint, as opposed to equality. In police complaints, it is the police who have the weapons with which to hurt us. Or, as Officer Farr has said, the nightsticks wrapped around our skulls, and the fist up somewhere so vile I cannot repeat it. We civilians only have our voices. Police should have a higher burden of proof to justify their actions, since having the badge itself influences a sense of credibility that we don't have. I know you are aware of these disgusting comments circulating around from officers. I include details in my written testimony. I reached out to many resources for help, but was told that despite the screenshots and sources, the post was deleted, so there's not enough documentation. There is a man in CPD wanting to find me off duty, and all he has to do is delete that post to allow him that chance. There are technicalities protecting CPD's misconduct. They can find minuscule rules to justify an overstep of power, like saying if the tape measure proves he is 4 inches too far off the curb, they can tow his car. While Deputy Chief Woods admits they were looking at cars due to the event planned later that day. That towing was an abuse of power, and all the officers had to do was find a minuscule rule to justify it. Imagine if the rule is as vague as feeling threatened. Ultimately, a review board has to rely on behavioral discretion, not the letter of the law. Laws are not inherently peaceful, and peace is not always lawful. Ms. Rosa Parks taught us that a long time ago. The decision-making process must look beyond justifications and see if the conduct mirrors how a reasonable citizen would respond. For example, if the answer is no, a reasonable citizen would have just given the man a $20 ticket instead of attempting to thwart a free speech event by using his car as a scapegoat. Then this deserves justice. Questions I have about this board are, how will the review processes be transparent to the public for a sense of trust while maintaining confidentiality? Can this board in some way be alerted once officers hit a certain number of internal complaints? Would the education materials provided to the commission be public? Again, it's important to me that systemic issues and equity is emphasized adequately in training. And will the board merely make recommendations to the police themselves for action? And to Chief Quinlan, I would say, if the police are to protect and serve us, the union can do this by earnestly accepting our opinions on how to implement this board and not stall the issue once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Travenor. And I certainly think that as we go through this process, my goal, and I think I speak for my council members as well, is that we intend to try to be as transparent with folks as possible to ensure that people understand, what this work is going to look like and hopefully meet community expectations.
Councilmember Dorrance, may I make have a statement?
Absolutely.
I just wanted to respond. The testimony just said that she referenced 2 comments that I think a lot of us have seen, screenshotted from social media. In those comments, they actually also referenced me and myself and Congresswoman Beatty. And just for folks to know, those comments are under review and in internal investigation. So those comments are being looked at.
Thank you, Council President, for providing that additional context. Our last speaker this evening is Mr. Jordan Hawkins. Mr. Hawkins, are you with us?
Yes. Can you guys hear me?
We can. Mr. Hawkins, you've got 3 minutes, and let us know if you're here representing any organization.
Absolutely. Awesome. So I'm here today representing the Central Ohio Young Black Democrats. Many of you on council have a relationship with our organization. We have spoken with you in the past couple of weeks. So you're very familiar with who is in this organization. So I wanted to start by thanking you guys, everybody, for allowing us to speak on this issue of independent investigations and civilian oversight for the Columbus Police Department. And I would like to say that we are living in what is the most diverse, widespread, and continuous movement in our lifetime that demands that we address many of the injustices done to our most vulnerable communities here in Columbus and throughout the world. Obviously, we live in a city where we have a completely Democratic controlled city council. And so we ask ourselves, how did we get here? I think that if we are all truly about being about racial and economic justice, which is what we are supposed to be about as Democrats, we have to step up now and we have to take bold action. It is not enough for us to pay lip service. or to, spend hours and weeks discussing solutions when we know exactly what must be done. I would also like to add that members of the Central Ohio Young Black Democrats, we are standing with City Council, and we want to support you all as you guys seek solutions to these problems. But we are encouraging everybody to be bold, and we are encouraging everybody to speak through their actions, not just through their words. As it pertains to the issue at hand, we believe that as taxpayers in the city of Columbus, citizens, we should have the say and the oversight and investigation of Columbus police. We pay their salaries. Over a third of our city's annual budget, which last time I checked was over $361 million, it goes to funding the police department. For that mere fact alone, it is unnerving, as folks had said earlier, that we don't already have an independent body that can review incidences of police misconduct and violence. Other cities like Minneapolis, they have civilian review boards. So do cities like Cleveland. But what I would caution us as we move forward is to understand that those boards and the data and instances kind of show it. They don't have as much teeth as what we should probably give our civilian review board. For example, since 2012 in Minneapolis, over 2,600 complaints have been filed against the police, but only 12 resulted in discipline, with the most severe punishment being a 40-hour suspension. Up in Cleveland, you don't have to look that far. They have a civilian review board that only ruled on 36 out of 441 cases of alleged police misconduct in recent years. I would also like to highlight in 2014, obviously we all remember 14-year-old Tamir Rice being gunned down in a park by Cleveland police officers. The civilian review board in Cleveland found that the officers who were on the scene handling Tamir Rice's sister, they put her in the back of a car. They had paramedics show up, and they had his sister watch for hours while they dealt with her brother's body. Clearly a miscarriage of justice in dealing with somebody who had just gone through something traumatic. The Civilian Review Board in Cleveland recommended stiffer penalties for those officers and what ultimately was carried out. We need a board that actually has some sort of power to not only give the public a sense of ease when it comes to how they can look at this issue, but a board that has legal power to not only make recommendations on punishment to the police chief, but also one that has the power to bring charges against officers in the case of extreme misconduct and or violence. So we submitted testimony, and I would encourage all the members of City Council to go look at it. It details exactly what we are looking for, but I believe overall, and the Central Ohio Young Black Democrats believe overall, that we need a body that is composed of members of the community that have no affiliation with the police and or city, and one that provides a actual transparent look at how we can make recommendations and demands to the police on how they should be trained, how they should conduct themselves in purpose, and exactly what type of diverse hires and people they are bringing in. So with that, again, I want to say that the aforementioned policies in our submitted testimony and a lot of the things I've said are coming from the heart. We believe that these policies are the things that we need to change in our community. And we look forward to the continued discussion on how we can make actual change in our society and actual change here in Columbus. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins, and I appreciate the opportunity for you and the group to have already engaged with many members of council and your engagement tonight, and I would hope the continued engagement on this issue and others as we move forward. So appreciate you being here. Also want to thank everyone who participated this evening as we close things out. Certainly my colleagues, Mitch Brown, Shayla Favor, Manuel Remy, Council President Pro Tem Elizabeth Brown, Council President Hardin, City Attorney Klein, Chief of Police Tom Quinlan, Brian Orr from NACOL, who provided, I think, one of the best presentations I've seen as we've went through this reimagining process over the past month. So thanks again, Brian, for that. Appreciate, again, folks on my team, CTV, and the council clerk staff, especially Angie Burks and Mark Carter, for putting this hearing together and staying late with us what feels like every few nights now. So thanks for doing that. Encourage for folks that are looking for more information about what we talked about tonight. They can call my office at 614-645-8201. Folks are welcome to email me at radorns, DORANS, @columbus.gov. So appreciate folks being here and sharing with us their perspective and learning more about what I think is going to be one of the biggest topics that comes out of council's discussion around reimagining public safety. So with that, I'd like to open it up to my council colleagues for any closing remarks before I allow Chair of the Public Safety Committee, Mitch Brown, to finish this off tonight. President Pro Tem, do you have anything to finish this out?
I'll just underscore my commitment to doing this right in Columbus. People have rightly pointed out that we don't have one of these yet, and we sort of lag the pack of larger cities. And that means that we can get it right. And that has to be what each of us is called to commit ourselves to. And so I appreciate the engagement of people in helping guide us there. And it's my commitment to do something that really garners, builds, nurtures, et cetera, public trust far into the future.
Thank you. Councilmember Favor?
On Monday, we held a hearing to discuss hate group affiliation with our officers, and Professor Jeffries with Ohio State University said something that I've just really been underscoring a sentiment that I feel very deeply, that we have to, as a society, as a legislative body, continue to press beyond simplistic ideas of change. And as we continue to hear more and more from the community, I hear the sense of urgency. As a person of color, I am very aware of the urgency that is upon us as a legislative body. But I also understand that the work that we're doing is not easy. The board cannot come together overnight. Creating legislation with actual teeth does not happen in a vacuum. And so I humbly still make the request for our residents to continue to go along this journey with us as we have these hearings and we continue to engage with residents on a daily basis about this specific subject matter. And so to Chair Brown and to Councilmember Dorans and Council President Hardin, thank you for convening the conversation tonight. I've learned so much around civilian review boards and some additional measures that we can take to help create a strong board in Columbus. To the Safety Commission, thank you all for joining us as well. And I also once again want to say thank you for the work that you all did to help inform the discussion tonight. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Councilmember Favor. Councilmember Remy.
Thank you, Councilmember Dorans, Chair Brown, rest of my colleagues. I appreciate the opportunity to sit here this evening and hear the comments from our presenters, from our Safety Commission, from the general public. When I first got onto council in 2018, I remember, starting to engage with our police department and telling people outside of government, that it's like this giant silo over there, and not even the mayor or the council necessarily could have much of an impact because of the way that the culture had been steeped for decades. And, the good thing about the things that have happened in the last several weeks, many weeks now, is that these conversations are real and impactful. And I see a willingness, not just by the political will that we might have as a body, but also amongst the department to have serious, engaging conversations about what tomorrow's Columbus Police Department looks like. And so every one of these meetings is very important. We are all fully engaged, and it is the right time. But as Councilmember Favor just mentioned, decades and generations of issues that culturally created the department take a little bit more time than fixing just overnight. And so we're working hard and diligently. The conversations are immense between all of our offices within the department and within the community. And we're going to continue to listen. We're going to continue to act. And we're going to come up with something that I think all of the members, the residents of Columbus, and all of us within the city are going to be proud of at some point in time. So thank you so much for this hearing this evening, and look forward to my hearing tomorrow night on no-knock warrants.
Thank you, Council Member. I would like to allow Chair of the Public Safety Committee, Mitch Brown, to go before we allow Council President Harden to close out.
Councilor Dorns, and obviously to my colleagues, thank you. This is a very, very complicated and involved subject matter. It has been for a very long time, and it will continue to be. Certainly, I want to thank the Columbus Community Safety Advisory Commission for their work and their involvement and their continued involvement. I'm reminded of a friend of mine who is a psychologist who told me, always adjust your expectations, but keep your standards high. We have to recognize that this is not an easy task. It never has been. And it never will be. But we work at it aggressively every single day, and we will hold the appropriate people accountable. The police division works for the citizens of the city of Columbus, as they do in every other city. How we go about holding them accountable is going to be up to us. And the recognition, as you already heard from Mr. Kaur, is it is evolving. It doesn't just do it, and it's the way it's going forever and ever. It is an evolving process. Again, I don't mean to be making crazy analogies, but how do you eat an elephant? One piece at a time. And that's the way in which you attack this problem. And recognizing that we don't want a single citizen in the city of Columbus to be handled inappropriately by a Columbus police officer. Not now, not in the future, and certainly not in the past. But we have to put together the appropriate mechanisms to make that happen. And this council has sworn to do that, and we will do the best we can to make that all happen. So I appreciate everyone who participated tonight. Brian, I say to you, thank you for the information that you provided. I think it is valuable for all of us to learn about this process. Yes, I probably have the most experience and the most history with regards to public safety. I take my very seriously. And I will say to you, Brian, in particular, my experience is in emergency medicine, not in law enforcement. I learned about how to deal with the issues involving police officers and firefighters and the role that they play in public safety. So it can be somebody outside of law enforcement who takes on the responsibility of leading the responsible activities of our law enforcement officers. So with that, I'll pass it on to the council president because we got another meeting tomorrow night, which will take 3 or 4 hours, and I'm so looking forward to it. So with that, I'll turn it to the council president.
Well, thank you so much, Chair Brown. Mr. Kaur, if you weren't understanding the analogy with that Chair Brown was saying, at a moment during this hearing, we had 2 public safety chairs, one current and one former. Our Councilmember Brown was our former public safety chair, and so his background and his expertise greatly value on our council. I want to echo Councilmember Dorns and all of my colleagues. Thanks to the Community Safety Advisory Commission, to Mr. Kaur from NACO, as well as the folks from the administration who participated this evening. You know, in order to implement the Community Safety Advisory Commission recommendations around independent oversight and investigations, we need changes in the FOP contract and our laws. Council certainly does not negotiate the contract, but we can change the law. It's not our role to immediately legislate every detail regarding how these bodies would operate, but I do believe it is our duty to set a strong foundation so that the folks like the Mayor's Civilian Review Board Working Group can build the structure that we need on top of that foundation. Next week, we will have another and hopefully our final hearing after tomorrow on this topic as well as others. So to the public, like I said at the beginning, we told you what we were going to do. We told you when we were going to do it. We told you how you can be engaged. And then we told you we would vote by the end of this month. And as my council members have alluded, they are working, and not just them, their staffs, the administration, police department, and giving us information, are working around the clock to make sure that what we bring to the public in terms of legislation, in terms of ordinance, in terms of the beginning of our reform agenda, as we begin this process of reimagining public safety, is sound policy that will keep our community safe and vibrant moving forward. That is our promise. That is our commitment. And as Councilmember Mitch Brown said, that is what we are sworn to do. So thank you so much. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.